the blood-soaked earth of the southeastern Balkans, holds secrets that would make even the most hardened historian tremble with anticipation. Beneath the rolling hills of modern Bulgaria, southern Romania, northeastern Greece, and European Turkey lies evidence of a civilization so formidable, so enigmatic, that its very existence challenges everything we thought we knew about the ancient world. This is not merely the story of another forgotten kingdom. This is the chronicle of a people who forged an empire from chaos, who drank wine from the skulls of their enemies, and whose warriors were so feared that even the mighty Greeks spoke their name in hushed whispers. Welcome to the world of the Thracians, and the rise of the most powerful kingdom you've never heard of. Long before the first stone was laid in Athens, long before Rome was anything more than a collection of mud huts on 7 hills, the Thracian tribes were already masters of war, metallurgy, and a form of spirituality so intense that it would later give birth to one of Greece's most important gods. The archaeological excavations that have pierced the veil of time reveal a tapestry of Bronze Age settlements dating from approximately 1600 BC, communities that established patterns of warfare, social organization, and religious practice that would echo through millennia and ultimately shape the destiny of the ancient Mediterranean world. At Aero, near the modern city of Plovdiv, archaeologists made discoveries that sent shockwaves through the academic community. Multi-layered settlements containing bronze weapons of extraordinary craftsmanship, ornate jewelry that rivaled anything produced in the great civilizations of the Near East, and ceramic vessels demonstrating both local artistic genius and far-reaching trade connections that stretched from the Aegean to the steppes of Central Asia. But it was the weapons that told the most compelling story. Double-headed axes capable of splitting a man from crown to groin, curved daggers designed for the intimate work of close combat, and elaborate horse bits that revealed a warrior culture obsessed with mounted warfare centuries before cavalry would become the dominant force on ancient battlefields. These artifacts, discovered in carefully arranged burial contexts that spoke of elaborate funeral rituals and profound beliefs about the afterlife, painted a picture of a society where social stratification based on military achievement was already deeply entrenched. The Thracian warrior elite did not merely fight. They lived for combat, they breathed violence, and they believed that death in battle was not an ending but a glorious transformation that would carry them into the realm of the gods. The transition to the Iron Age around 1200 BC marked a transformation so profound that it would alter the trajectory of Thracian civilization forever. Ironworking technology, likely introduced through contact with Anatolian peoples who had mastered the secrets of this revolutionary metal, revolutionized every aspect of Thracian life. At sites such as Vatsa and Panagoriste, archaeologists have unearthed iron spearheads capable of punching through bronze armor like paper, swords that held their edge through countless battles, and agricultural implements that transformed the Thracian relationship with the land itself. But it was the weapons that captured the imagination of the ancient world. The Thracian rhomphaia, a curved single-edged blade mounted on a long pole, became legendary throughout the Mediterranean. Greek sources consistently praised its deadly effectiveness, describing how Thracian warriors could decapitate a fully armored hoplite with a single sweeping blow. The sika, a curved dagger designed for thrusting attacks that could slip between the plates of any armor, became so associated with assassination that the Romans would later use the term sicarius to describe professional killers. These were not merely weapons. They were extensions of a warrior philosophy that valued individual combat prowess above all else. The burial practices of the Thracians during this period reveal insights into their worldview that are simultaneously fascinating and deeply unsettling. The practice of tumulus burial, constructing massive earthen mounds over stone-lined chambers, became increasingly elaborate as Thracian society grew more complex and hierarchical. These burial mounds, scattered across the Thracian landscape in the thousands, served not merely as final resting places for the elite, but as territorial markers asserting clan control over specific regions, as religious sites where the living could commune with the honored dead, and as monuments to the martial achievements that defined Thracian identity. The Mogilan tumulus near Vratsa, dating to the 4th century BC, contained a warrior's burial that exemplified the wealth and power of the Thracian aristocracy. Gold and silver vessels of extraordinary craftsmanship, bronze armor decorated with scenes of combat and divine figures, and the remains of sacrificed horses, loyal companions who had served their master in the afterlife just as they had served him in life. The construction of these tumuli required the mobilization of hundreds, sometimes thousands, of laborers working for months or even years, a testament to the hierarchical societies that had emerged among the Thracian peoples and their ability to command resources on a scale that rivaled the great civilizations of the ancient world. Within the burial chambers, archaeologists have discovered evidence of mortuary rituals that speak to beliefs about death and the afterlife that were both sophisticated and, to modern sensibilities, deeply disturbing. The positioning of bodies, typically in a contracted fetal position facing east toward the rising sun, suggests beliefs about rebirth and solar symbolism that would later manifest in Thracian religious practices. But there were darker elements as well, evidence of human sacrifice, of servants and concubines who followed their masters into death, of rituals involving blood and fire that hint at a spirituality far removed from the rationalist traditions of classical Greece. Before the political unification that would create the Odrysian Kingdom, the Thracian territories were divided among numerous tribal confederations, each controlling distinct geographical regions and maintaining unique cultural characteristics that would later contribute to the complex tapestry of Thracian civilization. Understanding these tribal divisions is essential for comprehending the magnitude of the achievement that would follow, the forging of a unified kingdom from peoples who had spent centuries fighting each other with the same ferocity they directed against foreign enemies. The Getae occupied the fertile plains between the Danube River and the Balkan Mountains, establishing fortified settlements that controlled crucial river crossings and trade routes connecting the Black Sea coast with the interior of the European continent. Their territory extended from the shores of the Euxine westward to the Carpathian foothills, encompassing some of the richest agricultural land in the ancient Balkans, land that could support the dense populations and professional warrior classes necessary for military dominance. Archaeological evidence from Getic settlements reveals a society that combined pastoralism with intensive agriculture on a scale that impressed even Greek observers accustomed to the productive farmlands of the Mediterranean world. Excavations at Zimnichia and Bordusani have uncovered large storage facilities capable of holding grain sufficient to feed thousands, sophisticated irrigation systems that transformed marginal lands into productive fields, and evidence of surplus production that supported not only local populations but extensive trade networks reaching throughout the ancient world. The Getae developed distinctive pottery styles characterized by geometric patterns and animal motifs that reflected their close relationship with the natural environment of the Danubian plains, a relationship that was simultaneously practical and deeply spiritual, rooted in beliefs about the sacred nature of the land and its creatures. In the mountainous regions of the Central and Western Balkans, the Bessi Confederation controlled the strategic passes and mining districts that would prove crucial to later Thracian prosperity. The Bessi territory centered around the Rhodope Mountains, where they extracted silver, gold, and iron ore from extensive mining operations that had been developed over centuries of accumulated expertise. Their settlements, typically located on defensible hilltops that could be approached only through narrow defiles easily defended by small numbers of determined warriors, were fortified with massive stone walls and featured sophisticated water collection systems designed to withstand prolonged sieges. The Bessi developed a reputation as the fiercest warriors among a people already renowned for their martial prowess. Their weapons and ornaments displayed distinctive artistic styles that combined geometric patterns with stylized animal representations. Wolves, eagles, and serpents that served as clan totems and spiritual protectors. Their control of mountain passes allowed them to extract tribute from merchants and armies attempting to traverse their territory, creating wealth that supported elaborate religious ceremonies conducted at sacred sites high in the mountains, where, according to Greek sources, the Bessi maintained oracles that rivaled Delphi in their reputation for prophetic accuracy. Along the Black Sea coast, the Thracian coastal confederations controlled the fertile river valleys and natural harbors that would later attract Greek colonists seeking new opportunities for trade and settlement. These coastal Thracians developed sophisticated maritime technologies, including large rowing vessels capable of both river and sea navigation, that enabled them to project power throughout the Black Sea region and maintain commercial relationships with communities as distant as the Crimean Peninsula and the shores of Anatolia. Their settlements featured extensive dock facilities and warehouse complexes that facilitated trade in grain, livestock, metals, slaves, and the luxury goods that flowed along the ancient trade routes connecting east and west. The arrival of Greek colonists along the Thracian coast beginning in the 8th century BC initiated a period of profound cultural and economic transformation that would reshape Thracian society in ways both obvious and subtle. The establishment of Greek colonies at Apollonia Pontica, Mesembria, Odessos, and Tomis created permanent Greek settlements that served as conduits for Hellenic culture, technology, and political ideas, but also as sources of conflict, competition, and cultural anxiety that would influence Thracian development for centuries to come. Greek colonization introduced new agricultural techniques, including viticulture and olive cultivation, which proved particularly successful in the coastal regions where Mediterranean climate conditions prevailed. The Greeks brought advanced pottery-making techniques that Thracian craftsmen eagerly adopted and adapted, architectural knowledge that influenced the construction of Thracian elite residences and religious structures, and writing systems that gradually penetrated Thracian society despite the strong oral traditions that had previously dominated cultural transmission. But perhaps most significantly, Greek political concepts and administrative practices provided models that Thracian leaders would later adapt to create more centralized political structures capable of competing with the great powers of the ancient world. The economic impact of Greek colonization extended far beyond the immediate coastal regions, penetrating deep into the Thracian interior through trading networks that exchanged manufactured goods, wine, and olive oil for Thracian grain, livestock, metals, and slaves. These trade relationships created new forms of wealth and social stratification within Thracian communities, as local leaders who controlled access to Greek goods gained prestige and political influence that transcended traditional tribal hierarchies. Archaeological evidence from inland Thracian sites shows increasing quantities of Greek pottery coins and luxury goods during the 7th and 6th centuries BC, while Thracian artistic styles began incorporating Greek motifs and techniques, creating hybrid forms that reflected the cultural synthesis occurring throughout the region. But this cultural exchange was not unidirectional. Greek colonies adopted Thracian agricultural practices suited to local conditions, military techniques that proved effective in the challenging terrain of the Balkan interior, and religious customs that resonated with spiritual needs that Greek rationalism could not fully satisfy. The worship of Dionysus, the god of wine, ecstasy, and divine madness, was believed by many ancient sources to have originated in Thracian territory before being adopted into the Greek pantheon, a claim that speaks to the profound influence that Thracian spirituality exerted on the broader Mediterranean world. The religious beliefs and mythological traditions of the Thracian peoples provided the spiritual foundation upon which the later Odrysian Kingdom would build its legitimacy and cultural identity. Thracian religion centered around the worship of a great goddess, often identified with the Earth Mother, who controlled fertility, death, and rebirth in an eternal cycle that mirrored the agricultural rhythms of the Thracian homeland. This goddess, known by various names including Bendis and Cotys, was typically depicted as a huntress, accompanied by wild animals, and associated with nocturnal rituals involving ecstatic dancing and ritual intoxication that transported participants into altered states of consciousness, where the boundaries between human and divine dissolved. The cult of Dionysus held particular significance in Thracian religious practice, with many Greek sources claiming that the god originated in Thracian territory before being adopted into the Greek pantheon. Thracian Dionysiac rituals involved the consumption of fermented beverages, frenzied dancing that continued until participants collapsed from exhaustion, and ritual sacrifice that induced altered states of consciousness believed to facilitate direct communication with the divine realm. These practices were conducted in sacred groves and mountain sanctuaries that served as pilgrimage destinations for Thracians throughout the region, creating networks of religious connection that transcended tribal boundaries and provided a foundation for later political unification. Thracian mythology emphasized the connection between the living and the dead, with elaborate funeral rites designed to ensure the deceased's successful transition to the afterlife. The Thracian hero horseman, a divine figure depicted riding a horse and carrying a spear, appeared frequently in religious art and represented the ideal of the warrior who achieved immortality through glorious death in battle. This mythological figure would later influence Thracian royal iconography and provide a model for kingly authority based on divine favor and military prowess, a model that would prove remarkably effective in legitimizing the unprecedented political centralization that was about to transform Thracian society. The practice of ritual tattooing among Thracian nobles served both religious and social functions, with specific patterns indicating tribal affiliation, social rank, and spiritual protection. Greek sources describe elaborate tattoo designs covering the arms, legs, and torsos of Thracian warriors, creating distinctive visual markers that reinforced group identity and individual status, while simultaneously serving as permanent reminders of the spiritual forces that protected the bearer in battle and guided them in the afterlife. These tattoos incorporated religious symbols, animal motifs, and geometric patterns that reflected the bearer's relationship with the divine realm and their position within the complex hierarchies of Thracian society. Thracian religious practices also included the worship of Zalmoxis, a deity associated with immortality and the afterlife, who was said to have descended into the underworld and returned with knowledge of death's mysteries. The cult of Zalmoxis involved elaborate initiation ceremonies and the belief that worthy individuals could achieve immortality through proper ritual observance and moral conduct, a belief system that would later influence Odrysian concepts of royal authority and divine kingship. providing ideological foundations for political structures that would rival the great empires of the ancient world. The stage was now set for the most dramatic transformation in Thracian history. The sacred groves and mountain sanctuaries that had served as centers of religious and political authority for centuries were about to become the launching points for a revolution that would reshape the balance of power throughout the southeastern Balkans. A chieftain was about to emerge from the Odrysian tribe who possessed both the vision to imagine a unified Thracian kingdom and the ruthless determination to make that vision reality, no matter how much blood would need to be spilled in the process. Around 460 BC, from the mist-shrouded valleys of the upper Hebrus River, a figure emerged who would fundamentally alter the course of Thracian history. His name was Teres, and he was about to accomplish something that generations of Thracian chieftains had attempted and failed: the unification of the fractious Thracian tribes into a single centralized kingdom, capable of challenging the great powers of the ancient world. Unlike previous Thracian leaders, who had contented themselves with raiding, temporary alliances, and the accumulation of personal glory, Teres possessed both the strategic vision to imagine a lasting political structure and the military capability to forge that vision into reality through blood, fire, and an iron will that would brook no opposition. The Odrysian tribe from which Teres drew his initial support occupied a strategically advantageous position in the fertile river valleys between the Rhodope Mountains and the Balkan Range. Their territory encompassed some of the richest agricultural land in Thrace, with extensive grain fields that could feed armies, vineyards that produced wine renowned throughout the ancient world, and pastures that supported the horses essential to Thracian military effectiveness. But geography alone does not explain the Odrysian rise to dominance. The Odrysians had maintained trading relationships with Greek coastal colonies for generations, providing them with access to advanced weapons, luxury goods, and, most importantly, knowledge of Greek military and administrative techniques that would prove crucial in Teres's consolidation efforts. Archaeological evidence from Odrysian settlements dating to the mid-5th century BC reveals a society undergoing rapid and deliberate transformation. Excavations at sites near modern Plovdiv have uncovered evidence of expanded fortifications constructed according to principles that combine traditional Thracian defensive techniques with innovations borrowed from Greek military architecture. Centralized storage facilities, capable of holding grains sufficient to support large armies for extended campaigns, suggest systematic preparation for military operations on a scale unprecedented in Thracian history. Workshops producing standardized weapons and equipment, spearheads of uniform size and weight, armor components designed for mass production, horse equipment manufactured according to consistent specifications, indicate the emergence of centralized control over craft production and military supply that would prove essential for sustained military operations. The pottery assemblages from this period show increasing uniformity in style and production techniques, suggesting not merely cultural homogenization, but deliberate administrative control over economic activities that had previously been conducted according to local traditions and individual preferences. Teres was not merely building an army, he was constructing the institutional foundations for a state capable of projecting power across vast territories and maintaining that power through generations of rulers who would inherit not just a throne but a functioning governmental apparatus. Teres initiated his consolidation campaign by systematically eliminating rival claimants within his own tribal confederation. The traditional Thracian practice of blood feuds and competing royal lineages had historically prevented the emergence of unified leadership, as ambitious chieftains spent more energy fighting their relatives than their external enemies. But Teres employed a combination of military force and strategic marriages to neutralize internal opposition with a ruthlessness that shocked even his contemporaries. Those who submitted received positions of honor and authority within the emerging kingdom. Those who resisted were destroyed with a thoroughness that left no survivors to seek revenge or rally opposition. He arranged marriages between his relatives and the daughters of subordinate chieftains, creating kinship networks that bound formerly independent leaders to his authority through family obligations and shared interests. These marriages were not merely diplomatic arrangements, but carefully calculated investments in political stability, creating webs of relationship that made rebellion against the Odrysian royal house equivalent to betrayal of one's own family. The children born from these unions would grow up with divided loyalties that ultimately favored the central authority that had arranged their parents' marriages and controlled the resources upon which their futures depended. The military innovations that enabled Teres' success drew heavily upon both traditional Thracian warfare practices and techniques observed from Greek military operations. Thracian warriors had always excelled in individual combat, wielding their distinctive rhomphaia pikes and sika daggers with deadly effectiveness that made them feared throughout the ancient world. But individual prowess, however impressive, could not overcome the disciplined formation fighting that had made Greek hoplite armies dominant on ancient battlefields. Teres recognized this limitation and implemented reforms that would multiply the battlefield impact of Thracian martial traditions. He organized his forces into units of approximately 100 warriors, each commanded by a trusted lieutenant who had sworn personal loyalty to the king through elaborate oath ceremonies conducted at sacred sites where the gods themselves were believed to witness and enforce the commitments made. These oaths, sealed with blood sacrifice and ritual consumption of wine mixed with the blood of the participants, created bonds that transcended ordinary military discipline. Violation of these sacred commitments was believed to bring not merely human punishment, but divine retribution that would pursue the oathbreaker into the afterlife itself. The Odrysian military system under Teres combined the mobility and individual skill of traditional Thracian fighters with the coordination and tactical flexibility that had made Greek hoplite formations so effective. Thracian cavalry, mounted on the sturdy horses bred in the river valleys of the interior, served as both scouts and shock troops capable of rapid deployment across the varied terrain of the Balkan interior. These mounted warriors carried javelins for ranged combat, curved swords optimized for mounted fighting, and small shields that allowed them to engage effectively in both mounted and dismounted combat depending on tactical circumstances. Infantry formations consisted of heavily armed spearmen, equipped with long pikes, bronze-reinforced leather armor, and large oval shields decorated with clan symbols and religious motifs that identified their bearers and invoked divine protection in battle. Behind these main battle lines, Teres deployed units of archers and slingers recruited from mountain tribes who possessed exceptional skill with missile weapons developed through generations of hunting in the challenging terrain of the Balkan highlands. The coordination of these different military elements required extensive training and discipline that reflected the increasingly centralized nature of Odrysian political organization. The first major campaign of territorial expansion targeted the Sapian Confederation, which controlled the strategic Maritsa River Valley and maintained close relationships with several Greek coastal cities. The Sapians had traditionally served as intermediaries in trade between the Thracian interior and Greek colonies, accumulating considerable wealth that they used to hire Greek mercenaries and purchase advanced weapons. Their principal stronghold, Anus, commanded river traffic and overland routes connecting the Aegean coast with the Danubian plains, a strategic position that made them both wealthy and dangerous. Teres launched his attack on Sapaean territory during the winter months, when traditional Thracian warfare typically ceased. This unexpected timing caught the Sapaean forces dispersed in winter quarters and prevented them from coordinating an effective defense. The Odrysian army moved rapidly along frozen river valleys, capturing isolated settlements and cutting off communication between Sapaean strongholds before their defenders could organize resistance. The element of surprise, combined with the superior organization of Odrysian forces, proved devastating. The siege of Athens lasted 3 months, during which Teres demonstrated the sophisticated engineering capabilities that his forces had developed through contact with Greek military techniques. The Odrysian siege works included wooden towers that allowed attackers to fire down into the fortress, battering rams constructed according to Greek designs, and tunnel systems that undermined sections of the defensive walls. When Athens finally fell, Teres executed the Sapaean royal family with a public brutality designed to demonstrate the consequences of resistance, but spared the general population, incorporating Sapaean warriors into his own forces and appointing Odrysian governors to oversee the conquered territory. This pattern of eliminating rival leadership while preserving local populations became a hallmark of Odrysian expansion policy. Teres understood that dead subjects paid no tribute and provided no soldiers, while surviving populations could be transformed into productive components of an expanding kingdom. The conquered peoples were not enslaved but incorporated into the Odrysian system as subordinate allies, whose obligations included tribute payments, military service, and acknowledgement of Odrysian supremacy, but who retained their local customs, religious practices, and social structures under the supervision of Odrysian appointed officials. The conquest of the Sapaean Confederation provided Teres with control over crucial trade routes and demonstrated to other Thracian tribes that the traditional balance of power had shifted decisively in favor of the Odrysians. The wealth captured from Sapaean treasuries funded further military campaigns and allowed Teres to reward his followers with land grants and positions of authority within the expanding kingdom. Greek merchants who had previously dealt with Sapaean intermediaries found themselves negotiating directly with Odrysian officials who proved equally capable of maintaining commercial relationships while extracting higher tribute payments that reflected the enhanced power of the new regime. Following his success against the Sapaeans, Teres turned his attention to the Bessi Confederation in the Rhodope Mountains. The Bessi controlled extensive mining operations that produced the silver and gold essential to maintaining military forces and conducting diplomatic relations with Greek city-states. Their mountain strongholds presented significant tactical challenges, as the narrow valleys and steep slopes negated many of the advantages that Odrysian cavalry and formation fighting provided in open terrain. The Bessi had never been conquered by any external power, and they had no intention of submitting to Odrysian authority without a fight that would test the limits of Teres's military capabilities. The campaign against the Bessi required different tactical approaches that showcased the adaptability of Odrysian military organization. Teres recruited local guides familiar with mountain trails and employed small, highly mobile units capable of operating independently in difficult terrain. Rather than attempting direct assaults on fortified positions that would result in catastrophic casualties, the Odrysians implemented a strategy of economic warfare, capturing mining settlements and disrupting the trade networks that supported Bessi military capabilities. Cut off from the revenues that funded their resistance, the Bessi found their ability to maintain their warrior forces steadily eroding. The decisive engagement occurred at a mountain pass, where Bessi forces attempted to block Odrysian access to their primary silver mining district. Teres employed a complex pincer movement that used the terrain to his advantage, sending cavalry units along ridgeline trails to attack the Bessi flanks, while his main infantry force engaged their front lines in the narrow pass. The battle lasted from dawn until midday, with both sides suffering heavy casualties and fighting of extraordinary ferocity. The Bessi warriors, fighting for their homeland and their freedom, displayed the martial prowess that had made them legendary throughout the ancient world. But the coordinated assault from multiple directions eventually broke their formation, and once the Bessi line collapsed, the slaughter began. The submission of the Bessi Confederation brought the crucial mining districts under Odrysian control and provided the financial resources necessary to support further expansion. Teres appointed Odrysian overseers to manage mining operations while allowing Bessi technical specialists to continue their work under new management. A pragmatic approach that preserved the expertise necessary for efficient extraction while ensuring that the wealth generated flowed to the Odrysian treasury. The silver and gold extracted from these mines funded the purchase of Greek weapons and equipment, supported diplomatic missions to Athens and other major powers, and financed the construction of royal residences and administrative centers throughout the growing kingdom. The administrative innovations that Teres implemented to govern his expanding territories represented a sophisticated synthesis of traditional Thracian practices and Greek organizational techniques. The tribute system that formed the backbone of Odrysian administration required conquered territories to provide annual payments of grain, livestock, metals, and military service. These tribute obligations were calculated based on the productive capacity of each region and adjusted periodically to account for changing economic conditions and population levels, a flexibility that prevented the economic exhaustion that had undermined previous attempts at Thracian political centralization. Local administration remained largely in the hands of traditional tribal leaders who had submitted to Odrysian authority, but these officials operated under the supervision of royal appointees who ensured compliance with central government policies. The royal appointees, typically drawn from the Odrysian nobility or proven military commanders, possessed authority to collect tribute, recruit soldiers, and adjudicate legal disputes that crossed tribal boundaries. This system preserved local customs and leadership structures while establishing clear lines of authority that ultimately led back to the royal court, a balance between centralization and local autonomy that would prove remarkably effective in maintaining political stability across diverse territories. The establishment of a permanent royal court represented perhaps the most significant departure from traditional Thracian political organization. Previous Thracian leaders had maintained seasonal camps that moved according to military campaigns and pastoral cycles, never establishing the fixed administrative centers that characterized more advanced political systems. But Teres constructed a capital complex near modern Plovdiv that served as the administrative and ceremonial center of the kingdom, a physical manifestation of the new political order that was transforming Thracian society. The royal court included residential quarters for the king and his family, administrative offices for government officials, workshops for producing royal regalia and weapons, and religious facilities where state ceremonies could be conducted. The physical layout reflected both Thracian architectural traditions and Greek influences that had been adapted to local conditions and requirements. The main royal residence featured a large central hall capable of accommodating several hundred people for ceremonial feasts and diplomatic receptions, events that reinforced royal authority and maintained loyalty among the nobility through displays of wealth, generosity, and martial prowess. This hall, constructed with massive wooden beams and decorated with bronze fittings and textile hangings depicting scenes of royal hunts and military victories, served as the setting for the elaborate rituals that reinforced royal authority and maintained loyalty among the nobility. The feasts held in this hall were legendary throughout the ancient world, occasions where wine flowed freely, where warriors competed in displays of martial skill, where poets sang of royal achievements and where the bonds between king and followers were renewed through shared consumption and celebration. Surrounding the central royal complex, administrative buildings housed the growing bureaucracy that managed tribute collection, military recruitment, and diplomatic correspondence. These officials, many of whom had received training in Greek administrative techniques, maintained written records using adapted Greek scripts that allowed for more sophisticated record-keeping than had been possible under traditional oral systems. The preservation of administrative documents from this period provides valuable insights into the complexity and efficiency of Odrysian governmental organization, and demonstrates that the Thracians were capable of adopting and adapting foreign innovations while maintaining their cultural distinctiveness. The integration of Greek administrative practices extended beyond simple record-keeping to encompass legal procedures, taxation methods, and diplomatic protocols that enhanced the kingdom's ability to interact with Greek city-states and other Mediterranean powers. Teres employed Greek secretaries and advisors who possessed the linguistic skills and cultural knowledge necessary to conduct negotiations with Athens, Sparta, and the various Greek colonies along the Thracian coast. These Greek officials served not as rulers, but as technical specialists who helped translate Odrysian political objectives into forms that Greek diplomats could understand and accept. The relationship between the emerging Odrysian Kingdom and the Athenian Empire during the Pentacontiacia period reflected the complex geopolitical dynamics of the mid-5th century BC Mediterranean world. Athens, at the height of its imperial power following victories over Persia, sought to secure its northern approaches and ensure reliable supplies of grain and timber from the Black Sea region. The Thracian territories controlled crucial overland routes and possessed the military strength to either facilitate or disrupt Athenian commercial and strategic interests, a reality that made the Odrysian Kingdom a power that Athens could neither ignore nor easily dominate. Initial diplomatic contacts between Teres and Athenian representatives occurred around 455 BC, when Athenian envoys arrived at the Odrysian court, seeking assurances that Thracian forces would not interfere with Athenian operations against Persian-held territories in the northern Aegean. These negotiations revealed the sophisticated diplomatic capabilities that the Odrysian court had developed, as Teres's representatives demonstrated detailed knowledge of Athenian political structures, military capabilities, and strategic objectives. The Thracians were not naive barbarians to be manipulated by Greek cleverness. They were shrewd political actors who understood the game of power and intended to play it to their advantage. The diplomatic agreement that emerged from these negotiations established a framework for cooperation that benefited both powers while preserving Odrysian independence and territorial integrity. Athens recognized Odrysian control over the Thracian interior and agreed to limit Greek colonial expansion to coastal areas that did not threaten established Thracian settlements. In return, Teres guaranteed safe passage for Athenian merchants and military forces traveling through Thracian territory, and agreed to provide military assistance against mutual enemies when requested. This arrangement transformed the Odrysian Kingdom from a potential threat into a valuable ally, a transformation that reflected Teres's understanding that diplomatic skill could achieve objectives that military force alone could not accomplish. The practical implementation of this diplomatic relationship required careful attention to the interests of Greek coastal cities that had previously maintained independent relationships with various Thracian tribes. Cities such as Abdera, Maronea, and Ainus found themselves caught between their traditional autonomy and the realities of Odrysian territorial expansion and Athenian imperial ambitions. Teres demonstrated considerable diplomatic skill in negotiating arrangements that preserved Greek municipal autonomy while establishing clear boundaries for Odrysian and Athenian spheres of influence, arrangements that satisfied all parties sufficiently to prevent the conflicts that might have disrupted the emerging regional order. The military cooperation between Odrysian and Athenian forces provided both sides with valuable experience in coordinating different military systems and tactical approaches. Thracian cavalry and light infantry proved particularly effective in supporting Athenian hoplite formations during operations in rough terrain where traditional Greek military formations faced significant disadvantages. Athenian naval capabilities complemented Thracian land forces by providing logistical support and preventing enemy forces from receiving reinforcements by sea. This cooperation demonstrated that Greeks and Thracians could work together effectively when their interests aligned, a lesson that would prove important in the decades to come. The emergence of the Odrysian Kingdom as a recognized regional power fundamentally altered the political landscape of the southeastern Balkans and established precedents that would influence Thracian political development for centuries. Teres' success in transforming a traditional tribal confederation into a centralized monarchy demonstrated that non-Greek peoples could adapt and implement sophisticated political and military innovations while maintaining their cultural identity and independence. The administrative systems, military organization, and diplomatic practices established during his reign provided the foundation for continued Odrysian expansion and political development under his successors. The death of Teres around 445 BC marked not an end, but a transformation of Odrysian ambitions. His son Sitalces inherited a kingdom that had already demonstrated its capacity to challenge the established order of the ancient world, and Sitalces possessed the vision and military capability to transform that kingdom into something even greater. The stage was set for the most ambitious military campaign in Thracian history, an invasion that would shake the foundations of the Greek world and demonstrate that the Odrysian Kingdom was not merely a regional power, but a force capable of reshaping the destiny of the ancient Mediterranean. Where Teres had focused primarily on consolidating Thracian territories and establishing diplomatic relationships with Greek powers, Sitalces possessed the vision and military capability to transform the Odrysian Kingdom into the dominant force throughout the entire southeastern Balkans. His reign would witness territorial expansion on a scale that dwarfed all previous Thracian achievements, creating an empire that stretched from the Danube River in the north to the shores of the Aegean Sea in the south. An empire that would field the largest army the ancient world had ever seen assembled by a non-Persian power. The inheritance that Sitalces received from his father provided him with unprecedented resources and organizational capabilities. The tribute system established by Teres generated enormous wealth from conquered territories, while the administrative apparatus centered at the royal court near Plovdiv had evolved into a sophisticated governmental structure capable of managing vast territories and diverse populations. The military reforms implemented during the previous reign had created professional fighting forces that combined traditional Thracian warrior skills with Greek tactical innovations, producing armies that could operate effectively across the varied terrain of the Balkan Peninsula. Archaeological evidence from sites throughout the Odrysian heartland reveals the massive military preparations that characterized the early years of Sitalces' reign. Excavations at weapon manufacturing centers have uncovered evidence of dramatically increased production of standardized spears, swords, and armor components. The scale of these operations suggests that Sitalces was equipping forces far larger than any previous Thracian ruler had commanded. Forces that would require not merely weapons but the logistical infrastructure to feed, supply, and coordinate them across vast distances. Storage facilities constructed during this period could accommodate grain supplies sufficient to support armies numbering in the tens of thousands for extended campaign seasons. The territorial expansion that defined Sitalces' reign began with campaigns against Thracian tribes that had remained independent during his father's consolidation efforts. The Triballi, who controlled the strategic Morava River Valley and maintained fortified settlements along the approaches to the Danube, represented the most significant obstacle to Odrysian expansion toward the north. Their territory encompassed crucial river crossings and mining districts that would provide both strategic advantages and economic resources essential to supporting larger military forces. The Triballi were renowned as fierce warriors who had never submitted to any external authority, and they had no intention of bowing to Odrysian demands. The campaign against the Triballi demonstrated the sophisticated military planning capabilities that Sitalces had developed through careful study of both Thracian and Greek warfare practices. Rather than launching direct assaults on heavily fortified positions, the Odrysian forces implemented a comprehensive strategy that combined economic warfare, diplomatic manipulation, and coordinated military operations across multiple fronts. Advanced units disrupted Tribalian trade networks and captured grain storage facilities, creating supply shortages that weakened enemy resistance before major battles occurred. Diplomatic envoys worked to detach Tribalian allies and subordinate tribes, offering better terms under Odrysian rule than they had received from their current masters. The decisive engagement took place near the confluence of the Morava and Danube rivers, where Tribalian forces had concentrated to defend their principal stronghold. Sitalces deployed his cavalry in a complex flanking maneuver that exploited the marshy terrain along the riverbank, while his main infantry force engaged the Tribalian center in a frontal assault designed to fix enemy forces in position. The battle lasted throughout an entire day, with both sides demonstrating the fierce fighting qualities that had made Thracian warriors legendary throughout the ancient world. The Tribalian warriors fought with desperate courage, knowing that defeat meant the end of their independence and the subjugation of their people. But the superior coordination of Odrysian forces, combined with their numerical advantage, eventually proved decisive. The Odrysian victory at this engagement effectively eliminated organized Tribalian resistance and opened the entire Danubian region to systematic conquest. Sitalces appointed Odrysian governors to oversee the captured territories while incorporating Tribalian warriors into his own forces through oath ceremonies that bound them to personal loyalty to the king. The wealth captured from Tribalian treasuries funded further military campaigns and provided resources for the construction of fortified administrative centers throughout the newly conquered regions. The pattern established by Teres, elimination of rival leadership combined with incorporation of conquered populations, continued to prove effective in building an empire that grew stronger with each conquest. With the Danubian approaches secured, Sitalces turned his attention to the coastal regions where Greek colonies maintained complex relationships with various Thracian tribes. The strategic situation along the Thracian coast had evolved significantly since his father's reign, as the outbreak of the Peloponnesian War had created new opportunities for ambitious rulers willing to exploit the conflicts between Athens and Sparta. The Greek cities found themselves increasingly dependent on Thracian goodwill for their security and commercial prosperity, providing Sitalces with leverage that previous Odrysian rulers had lacked. The incorporation of the coastal regions required different tactical approaches than the mountain and river valley campaigns that had characterized earlier Odrysian expansion. The Greek cities possessed sophisticated fortifications, professional military forces, and naval capabilities that traditional Thracian warfare methods could not easily overcome. Sitalces addressed these challenges by recruiting Greek military advisors and mercenaries, who possessed the technical knowledge necessary to conduct siege warfare and coordinate land-sea operations. The integration of Greek military specialists into Odrysian forces represented a significant evolution in the kingdom's military organization. These advisors brought knowledge of advanced siege techniques, including the construction of battering rams, siege towers, and catapult systems that could breach the massive stone walls protecting Greek coastal cities. More importantly, they provided training in the coordination of different military units and the logistical planning necessary to support large-scale operations over extended periods. The Greek mercenaries who entered Odrysian service came primarily from regions that had been devastated by the ongoing Peloponnesian War, including Boeotia, Thessaly, and various Aegean islands. These professional soldiers possessed extensive combat experience and familiarity with the latest developments in Greek military technology and tactics. Their integration into Odrysian forces required careful attention to issues of command structure, payment systems, and cultural accommodation that tested the administrative capabilities of the royal court. But the results justified the effort, as Odrysian military capabilities expanded dramatically. The military organization that emerged under Sitalces represented a sophisticated synthesis of Thracian, Greek, and barbarian elements that maximized the strengths of each component, while minimizing potential conflicts and inefficiencies. The traditional Thracian cavalry remained the elite strike force of Odrysian armies, with mounted units organized into squadrons of approximately 50 riders commanded by members of the royal family or trusted nobles. These cavalry formations operated with remarkable independence, conducting reconnaissance missions, raiding enemy supply lines, and exploiting tactical opportunities that arose during major engagements. The famous Thracian cavalry that became legendary throughout the ancient world during Sitalces' reign combined exceptional horsemanship with weapons and tactics specifically adapted to mounted combat. Thracian horses, bred in the river valleys of the interior, possessed the stamina and agility necessary for rapid movement across varied terrain while carrying fully equipped warriors. The riders themselves underwent rigorous training from childhood, developing skills in mounted archery, spear combat, and sword fighting that made them formidable opponents in both individual duels and mass formations. Thracian cavalry equipment reflected both practical considerations and cultural traditions that emphasized individual warrior identity within collective military organization. Each rider carried multiple javelins with iron points designed to penetrate armor and shields, a curved sword optimized for mounted combat, and a small round shield decorated with personal and clan symbols. The horses were equipped with bronze-reinforced bridles and saddle cloths that provided protection while allowing the mobility essential to cavalry effectiveness. The infantry forces that formed the backbone of Sitalces' armies incorporated elements drawn from throughout the expanded Odrysian territories, creating military units that reflected the ethnic and cultural diversity of the kingdom, while maintaining tactical cohesion and effectiveness. The heavy infantry consisted primarily of Odrysian and allied Thracian warriors equipped with the traditional rhomphaea pikes, bronze-reinforced leather armor, and large oval shields that had proven effective in previous campaigns. These formations operated according to tactical principles adapted from Greek hoplite warfare, but modified to accommodate Thracian fighting traditions and the varied terrain of Balkan battlefields. Supporting the heavy infantry, Sitalces deployed extensive light infantry forces recruited from mountain tribes throughout the kingdom. These warriors specialized in skirmishing tactics, using javelins, slings, and bows to harass enemy formations and exploit tactical opportunities without engaging in direct confrontation. Their intimate knowledge of local terrain and exceptional mobility made them invaluable for reconnaissance, harassment of enemy supply lines, and the rapid exploitation of battlefield successes. The integration of Greek military advisors and mercenaries into this traditional Thracian military structure required careful attention to command relationships and tactical coordination. Greek officers typically served as technical specialists responsible for siege operations, logistics planning, and the training of Thracian forces in advanced tactical formations. However, overall command remained firmly in Thracian hands, with Greek advisors operating under the authority of Odrysian nobles, who possessed both military experience and political legitimacy within the kingdom's power structure. The Great Invasion of Macedonia in 429 BC represented the culmination of Sitalces' military preparations and the most ambitious campaign ever undertaken by a Thracian ruler. The strategic context for this invasion emerged from the complex diplomatic and military situation created by the Peloponnesian War, as both Athens and Sparta sought allies capable of opening new fronts against their enemies. Macedonia under King Perdiccas II had maintained a precarious neutrality that satisfied neither major Greek power while creating opportunities for Thracian intervention. The immediate catalyst for the Macedonian invasion came from Athenian diplomatic overtures that promised significant rewards in exchange for Odrysian military intervention against Macedonian territories. Athens sought to pressure Perdiccas into providing more substantial support for Athenian operations in the northern Aegean, while simultaneously demonstrating to other potential allies the consequences of insufficient cooperation with Athenian interests. For Sitalces, the invitation provided an opportunity to extend Odrysian influence into regions that had previously remained beyond Thracian reach, and to demonstrate to the entire Greek world that the Odrysian Kingdom was a power to be reckoned with. The military force that Sitalces assembled for the Macedonian campaign dwarfed all previous Thracian armies in both size and organizational sophistication. According to Thucydides, the invasion force numbered approximately 150,000 warriors drawn from throughout the Odrysian territories and allied tribes. This massive army included roughly 50,000 cavalry, representing the largest mounted force ever assembled by a non-nomadic people in the ancient world. The logistical challenges of moving and supplying such a force required unprecedented organizational capabilities and demonstrated the administrative sophistication that the Odrysian Kingdom had achieved. The composition of the invasion army reflected the territorial extent of Sitalces' dominions and the military resources that systematic conquest had placed at his disposal. The core of the force consisted of approximately 40,000 Odrysian warriors equipped with standardized weapons and armor produced in the kingdom's manufacturing centers. These troops represented the professional military establishment that had evolved during decades of continuous warfare and territorial expansion. Allied contingents provided additional specialized capabilities and demonstrated the diplomatic success that had accompanied Odrysian military expansion. The Getae contributed approximately 30,000 warriors, including elite cavalry units mounted on horses bred specifically for warfare in the Danubian plains. Mountain tribes provided light infantry specialists whose knowledge of irregular warfare tactics proved invaluable during the campaign's later phases. Even tribes from beyond the traditional boundaries of Thracian territory, including groups from the northern Carpathian region, sent contingents to participate in what was perceived as a historic opportunity for plunder and territorial gain. The invasion route that Sitalces selected for the Macedonian campaign demonstrated both strategic sophistication and intimate knowledge of regional geography and political conditions. Rather than attempting a direct assault across the heavily fortified border regions, the Odrysian army advanced through territories controlled by tribes that had previously submitted to Odrysian authority or could be persuaded to provide passage rights in exchange for shares of expected plunder. The massive army moved in multiple columns that could converge for major engagements while spreading the logistical burden across a wider area and reducing vulnerability to defensive countermeasures. The advance guard consisted of cavalry units that secured river crossings, captured supply depots, and gathered intelligence about Macedonian defensive preparations. Behind them, the main infantry formations advanced along predetermined routes that had been surveyed in advance and provided with supply caches established through diplomatic agreements with local rulers. The psychological impact of the Odrysian invasion on Macedonia and the broader Greek world cannot be overstated. The appearance of such a massive barbarian army, operating with obvious strategic coordination and tactical sophistication, challenged Greek assumptions about the military capabilities of non-Greek peoples. Macedonian settlements throughout the border regions were abandoned as their populations fled southward, carrying reports of Thracian military strength that spread panic throughout the region. The Greeks had always considered themselves superior to the barbarians who surrounded them, but the army that Sitalces had assembled suggested that this assumption might be dangerously mistaken. The siege of Macedonian strongholds during the campaign demonstrated the advanced military engineering capabilities that Odrysian forces had developed through their integration of Greek technical knowledge with traditional Thracian warfare practices. At the fortress of Idamene, Sitalces engineers constructed elaborate siege works that included wooden towers exceeding the height of the defensive walls, battering rams protected by wheeled shelters, and tunnel systems designed to undermine the foundations of key fortifications. The economic impact of Sitalces' territorial expansion extended far beyond the immediate military conquests to encompass fundamental changes in trade patterns, resource exploitation, and wealth distribution throughout the southeastern Balkans. The Odrysian control of territory stretching from the Danube to the Aegean created unprecedented opportunities for the systematic exploitation of natural resources and the regulation of commercial activities that had previously operated beyond centralized political control. The tribute system that Sitalces expanded and refined during his reign generated wealth on a scale that transformed the material culture and political capabilities of the Odrysian Kingdom. Conquered territories provided annual payments calculated according to their productive capacity and strategic value, with assessments that included grain, livestock, metals, manufactured goods, and military service obligations. The administration of this tribute system required sophisticated record-keeping and enforcement mechanisms that demonstrated the bureaucratic capabilities of the Odrysian governmental apparatus. Control of major trade routes between the Greek world and the barbarian territories of Central and Eastern Europe provided the Odrysian Kingdom with enormous revenues from customs duties and transit fees. Merchants traveling between the Black Sea colonies and the Greek cities of the Aegean coast found themselves subject to Odrysian regulations and taxation that could significantly impact the profitability of their commercial ventures. The kingdom's ability to guarantee safe passage or disrupt trade, according to political considerations, gave Sitalces considerable leverage in diplomatic negotiations with Greek powers. The exploitation of gold and silver mines in the Pangaean Hills represented perhaps the most significant source of wealth that enabled Sitalces to maintain his massive military forces and conduct the ambitious campaigns that characterized his reign. These mining operations, which had been developed initially under local tribal control, were systematically expanded and rationalized under Odrysian administration. The introduction of more advanced extraction techniques, improved transportation systems, and centralized processing facilities dramatically increased the output of precious metals available to the royal treasury. The mining operations in the Pangaean Hills employed thousands of workers drawn from throughout the Odrysian territories, including prisoners of war, debt slaves, and free laborers attracted by relatively high wages. The working conditions in these mines were harsh by any standard, with workers facing constant dangers from cave-ins, flooding, and toxic gases that made mining one of the most hazardous occupations in the ancient world. However, the enormous profits generated by these operations provided the financial foundation for Odrysian military and political expansion. The processing and distribution of precious metals from the Pangaean Hills required sophisticated organizational systems that extended throughout the Odrysian territories and beyond. Raw silver and gold were transported under heavy guard to processing centers, where skilled craftsmen produced coins, jewelry, and decorative objects that served both economic and political functions. The standardization of Odrysian coinage during Sitalces' reign facilitated commercial transactions while projecting royal authority and political legitimacy throughout the kingdom's territories. But the great invasion of Macedonia, despite its impressive scale, ultimately failed to achieve its strategic objectives. The Macedonians, though unable to confront the Odrysian army in open battle, employed a strategy of evasion and attrition that gradually wore down the invaders. The massive Thracian force consumed supplies faster than they could be replenished, and as winter approached, Sitalces faced the choice between a costly siege of fortified Macedonian cities or withdrawal before his army starved. He chose withdrawal, and the great invasion ended not with a decisive victory, but with a negotiated settlement that preserved Macedonian independence while demonstrating the limits of Odrysian power projection. The death of Sitalces in 424 BC during a campaign against the Triballi marked the beginning of the most turbulent period in Odrysian history. The vast territorial empire he had constructed lacked the institutional mechanisms necessary to ensure peaceful succession, and the enormous wealth flowing from the Pangaean Hills mines and tribute payments from conquered territories had created a prize worth fighting for. The military organization that had enabled such spectacular expansion now provided multiple claimants with the means to pursue their ambitions through armed conflict. The sophisticated administrative apparatus that had managed territories from the Danube to the Aegean suddenly found itself divided among competing authorities, each claiming legitimacy while undermining the centralized control that had made Odrysian dominance possible. The kingdom that Sitalces had built was about to tear itself apart. Sitalces I, the nephew of Sitalces, emerged as the most prominent claimant to the Odrysian throne, controlling the traditional heartland around the upper Hebrus River Valley and commanding the loyalty of the core Odrysian tribal units that had formed the backbone of his uncle's military forces. His position derived strength from his control of the royal court complex near Plovdiv and the administrative records that documented tribute obligations and territorial boundaries throughout the kingdom. The royal treasury, with its accumulated wealth from decades of successful campaigns, provided Sitalces with the financial resources necessary to maintain professional military forces and secure the allegiance of wavering tribal leaders through generous distributions of gold and silver. However, Sitalces faced immediate challenges from other members of the extended royal family, who possessed their own claims to legitimacy and territorial bases of support. Sparadokos, who claimed descent from Teres through a different lineage, controlled significant territories in the eastern regions near the Black Sea coast, where his authority was recognized by several Greek colonial cities that had maintained tributary relationships with the Odrysian Kingdom. His position was strengthened by control of crucial trade routes and customs revenues that provided independent financial resources for military operations. The fragmentation of royal authority created opportunities for regional strongmen who had served as provincial governors under Sitalces to assert greater independence and pursue their own territorial ambitions. These local commanders possessed detailed knowledge of their region's military resources, economic capabilities, and political dynamics that enabled them to challenge central authority effectively. Many had developed personal relationships with tribal leaders and Greek colonial administrators that proved more durable than their formal obligations to the Odrysian crown. In the northern territories along the Danube, a commander named Medokos established what amounted to an independent principality by exploiting the confusion following Sitalces' death. His forces controlled the river crossings and fortified settlements that regulated trade between the Thracian territories and the barbarian peoples beyond the Danube. The wealth generated by customs duties and protection fees enabled Medokos to recruit mercenaries and expand his territorial control at the expense of both rival Thracian claimants and neighboring peoples who had previously acknowledged Odrysian suzerainty. The military forces that had enabled Odrysian expansion now became instruments of internal destruction as competing claimants turned the kingdom's sophisticated military organization against itself. The professional cavalry units that had terrorized Macedonia and intimidated Greek city-states found themselves divided among different commanders, with former comrades facing each other across battlefields where the tactical innovations developed during decades of external warfare were employed in fratricidal conflicts that weakened all participants. The first major engagement between rival claimants occurred near the confluence of the Hebrus and Maritsa rivers, where Sitalces the first encountered forces loyal to Sparadokos in a battle that demonstrated both the military capabilities that internal division was squandering and the tactical sophistication that Thracian warfare had achieved. The engagement began at dawn with cavalry skirmishes as mounted scouts from both armies probed enemy positions and attempted to identify tactical advantages in the marshy terrain along the riverbank. Sitalces deployed his forces according to the tactical principles that had proven successful during Sitalces' campaigns, with heavy cavalry on the flanks supported by infantry formations equipped with the traditional rhomphaia pikes and reinforced by units of Greek mercenaries who provided expertise in siege warfare and formation fighting. His battle line extended for nearly 2 miles along a low ridge that provided defensive advantages while allowing his cavalry to exploit their mobility in potential flanking maneuvers. Sparadokos commanded a smaller but more cohesive force that included elite units recruited from the coastal regions and equipped with weapons purchased through trade relationships with Greek cities. His tactical approach emphasized the use of missile weapons and rapid movement to avoid direct confrontation with Sitalces' larger army, while seeking opportunities to exploit weaknesses in enemy formations. The Eastern Thracian forces included a contingent of Scythian archers whose composite bows could penetrate armor at ranges that exceeded traditional Thracian weapons. The battle developed into a series of separate engagements as the broken terrain prevented coordinated movements by large formations. Cavalry clashes occurred simultaneously at multiple points along the battle line, with individual units pursuing their own tactical objectives while losing sight of the broader strategic situation. The famous Thracian war cries that had once struck terror into Greek and barbarian enemies now served to rally warriors fighting against their own countrymen in conflicts that served no purpose beyond the ambitions of competing royal claimants. The engagement lasted throughout the day, without producing a decisive victory for either side, as both armies suffered heavy casualties while failing to achieve their strategic objectives. Cotys retained control of the battlefield after Sparadokos withdrew his forces during the night, but the Pyrrhic nature of this success became apparent when several tribal contingents that had fought loyally during the battle subsequently defected to pursue their own interests rather than continue supporting a cause that offered little prospect of meaningful rewards. The inconclusive nature of this and similar engagements between royal claimants created conditions that encouraged the fragmentation of authority throughout the former Odrysian territories. Local commanders who had initially supported one claimant or another began calculating that their interests might be better served through independent action rather than continued loyalty to weakened central authorities. The tribute system that had generated enormous wealth for the royal treasury broke down as regional strongmen diverted payments to their own treasuries while maintaining only nominal acknowledgement of royal authority. The breakdown of central authority had immediate consequences for the Greek coastal cities that had prospered under Odrysian protection while contributing to royal revenues through tribute payments and commercial taxes. Cities such as Apollonia Pontica and Mesembria found themselves caught between competing Thracian claimants who demanded continued tribute payments while lacking the military strength to provide effective protection against raids by independent tribal groups or rival regional commanders. The political chaos in the Thracian interior created opportunities for external powers to intervene in ways that would have been impossible during the height of Odrysian unity under Sitalces. Macedonia, which had suffered devastating raids during the Great Invasion of 429 BC, began supporting Thracian factions that seemed likely to remain weak and divided rather than pose renewed threats to Macedonian territorial integrity. King Archelaus II recognized the strategic importance of preventing any restoration of unified Thracian power that might threaten Macedonian interests. Archelaus implemented a sophisticated policy of diplomatic and military intervention designed to maintain Thracian fragmentation while expanding Macedonian influence in regions that had previously been beyond his reach. He provided financial support to multiple Thracian claimants simultaneously, ensuring that none possessed sufficient resources to eliminate their rivals while all remained dependent on Macedonian assistance. This strategy required careful calibration to avoid creating a single dominant faction that might eventually turn against its Macedonian benefactors. The Macedonian intervention took various forms that reflected both the opportunities created by Thracian political chaos and the limitations of Macedonian resources and strategic objectives. Direct military support typically consisted of small contingents of professional soldiers and military advisors who could provide tactical expertise and training without representing major commitments of Macedonian resources. These forces were deployed strategically to influence the outcomes of specific engagements, while maintaining plausible deniability regarding Macedonian involvement in Thracian internal affairs. Financial assistance proved more significant in determining the course of Thracian conflicts, as competing claimants required enormous resources to maintain the military forces necessary for effective political action. Archelaus provided subsidies calculated to keep his chosen recipients competitive without enabling decisive victories that might end the conflicts he sought to perpetuate. The gold and silver that flowed from Macedonia into Thracian treasuries represented investments in regional instability that served Macedonian strategic interests. The most sophisticated aspect of Macedonian intervention involved the manipulation of succession disputes and territorial claims that provided pretexts for continued conflict among Thracian factions. Archelaus supported multiple claimants to the same territories while providing each with documentation and witnesses that appeared to validate their claims. This strategy ensured that even military victories by individual claimants would generate new disputes and conflicts, rather than contributing to political stabilization. Greek city-states beyond Macedonia also sought to exploit Thracian political fragmentation for their own strategic and commercial advantages. Athens, despite its alliance with Sitalces during the Peloponnesian War, recognized that a divided Thrace posed fewer threats to Athenian interests, while providing opportunities to secure favorable commercial arrangements with individual Thracian rulers who lacked the strength to impose unfavorable terms on Greek merchants. The Athenian approach to Thracian fragmentation reflected the broader strategic situation created by the ongoing Peloponnesian War and the need to secure northern approaches against potential threats while minimizing resource commitments that might weaken Athenian capabilities in more critical theaters. Rather than supporting any particular Thracian claimant, Athens maintained diplomatic relationships with multiple factions while providing limited assistance designed to prevent any single group from achieving dominance. Spartan intervention in Thracian affairs operated according to different strategic calculations that reflected Sparta's land-based military capabilities and its interest in creating problems for Athens in regions where Athenian influence had been traditionally strong. Spartan agents provided military training and equipment to Thracian groups that appeared willing to disrupt Athenian commercial activities or threaten Greek cities that maintained pro-Athenian policies. The fragmentation of political authority throughout the former Odrysian territories created conditions that enabled the rise of local strongmen who possessed neither legitimate claims to royal authority nor the territorial base necessary to challenge the major claimants directly. These regional commanders typically controlled single fortified settlements or small clusters of related communities that could provide military forces sufficient for local defense and limited offensive operations. The emergence of these local strongmen represented a fundamental transformation in the political organization of Thracian society, as traditional tribal structures gave way to more personalized forms of authority based on military capability and the ability to provide security and economic opportunities for followers. Unlike the hereditary chieftains who had dominated Thracian politics for centuries, these new leaders derived their authority from demonstrated success in warfare and their capacity to reward loyalty through distributions of plunder and captured territories. The military forces commanded by regional strongmen typically consisted of professional warriors who had served in the armies of major claimants before transferring their loyalty to local commanders who offered better prospects for advancement and enrichment. These forces were smaller than the armies commanded by royal claimants, but often possessed superior cohesion and tactical flexibility that enabled them to achieve objectives that larger but less disciplined forces could not accomplish. The economic foundations of regional autonomy movements varied according to local conditions and opportunities, but most depended on some combination of agricultural production, control of trade routes, and exploitation of natural resources that could generate the wealth necessary to maintain military forces and political independence. In mountainous regions, strongmen typically controlled mining operations or strategic passes that enabled them to extract tribute from merchants and travelers. In river valleys, agricultural surplus provided the foundation for political authority and military capability. The breakdown of the centralized tribute system that had supported Odrysian royal authority created opportunities for local strongmen to redirect economic resources that had previously flowed to the royal treasury. Communities that had contributed grain, livestock, and manufactured goods to support royal armies and administrative apparatus now found themselves subject to demands from multiple competing authorities, each claiming legitimate rights to tribute payments and military service. The competition for tribute and military service created conditions that often favored local strongmen over distant royal claimants. as communities could more easily assess the military capabilities and political reliability of nearby commanders than evaluate the prospects of claimants whose power bases lay in remote regions. Local strongmen could provide immediate protection against raids and military threats, while offering more direct access to leadership and more tangible rewards for loyalty and service. The proliferation of competing authorities throughout the Thracian territories created a complex political landscape where alliances and conflicts shifted rapidly according to changing circumstances and opportunities. Regional strongmen formed temporary coalitions to resist pressure from royal claimants or external enemies, but these alliances typically dissolved once immediate threats had been addressed, as each participant pursued independent objectives that often conflicted with those of their former allies. The military campaigns that characterized this period of political fragmentation differed significantly from the large-scale operations that had marked Sitalces' reign, as competing authorities lacked the resources and organizational capabilities necessary to maintain major armies for extended periods. Instead, warfare consisted primarily of raids, sieges of individual strongholds, and skirmishes between relatively small forces that sought to achieve limited objectives rather than decisive strategic victories. The tactical innovations that had enabled Odrysian military success during the period of expansion continued to evolve during the civil wars, as competing commanders experimented with new approaches designed to maximize the effectiveness of smaller forces operating with limited resources. The integration of Greek military techniques with traditional Thracian warfare practices produced hybrid tactical systems that emphasized mobility, surprise, and the efficient use of available resources. The economic disruption caused by continuous warfare and political instability had devastating effects on the prosperity that had characterized the Odrysian territories during the height of the kingdom's power. Trade routes that had generated enormous revenues through customs duties and protection fees became unsafe for merchants, while agricultural production declined as farmers were recruited for military service or fled their lands to escape the destruction caused by competing armies. The mining operations in the Pangaian Hills, which had provided the financial foundation for Odrysian expansion, suffered particularly severe disruption. As control of the region shifted repeatedly between competing claimants and local strongmen, the sophisticated extraction and processing systems developed during previous decades required stable political conditions and substantial investments in equipment and labor that became impossible to maintain during periods of continuous conflict. The gradual decline of mining revenues and the collapse of systematic tribute collection created a financial crisis that forced all competing authorities to seek alternative sources of wealth and military support. The breakdown of centralized economic management had ripple effects throughout the region, as communities that had prospered through participation in the broader Odrysian economic system found themselves isolated and vulnerable to predatory raids by desperate military commanders seeking resources to maintain their forces. The Thracian world had descended into chaos, but from this chaos, a new leader would emerge with a vision for restoration that would reshape the kingdom's destiny. Against this backdrop of political chaos and economic decline, Cotys I emerged from the eastern territories around 383 BC with a comprehensive strategy for reunifying the fragmented Odrysian domains. Unlike previous claimants, who had focused primarily on military conquest and the elimination of rivals, Cotys possessed a sophisticated understanding of the administrative and economic foundations necessary for sustainable political authority. His approach to restoration combined traditional Thracian concepts of royal legitimacy with Greek organizational techniques and Persian administrative practices that he had observed during his youth as a hostage at the Persian court. The territorial base from which Cotys launched his reunification campaign encompassed the fertile river valleys between the Hebrus and Maritsa rivers, including several fortified settlements that had maintained their prosperity through careful neutrality during the worst phases of the civil wars. His initial supporters included tribal leaders who had grown weary of continuous conflict and recognized that political stability offered better prospects for economic recovery than the endless cycle of raids and counter-raids that had characterized the previous decades. Cotys distinguished himself from rival claimants through his systematic approach to territorial consolidation, which emphasized the restoration of administrative institutions and economic systems, rather than merely the accumulation of military victories. His first major initiative involved the re-establishment of tribute collection systems in territories under his control, but with modifications that addressed some of the grievances that had contributed to regional resistance against centralized authority. The new tribute assessments were calculated more carefully according to actual productive capacity, while local communities received guarantees regarding the protection and services they could expect in exchange for their payments. The military reforms that Cotys implemented during the early phase of his restoration campaign reflected lessons learned from the failures of previous decades and incorporated innovations derived from his observations of Persian, Greek, and Macedonian military systems. The traditional Thracian emphasis on individual warrior prowess and cavalry mobility remained central to his forces, but these elements were integrated into more disciplined organizational structures that could sustain operations over extended periods while maintaining tactical flexibility. The professionalization of the Royal Army under Cotys involved the establishment of permanent military units whose members received regular payments, standardized equipment, and systematic training that transformed them from seasonal warriors into career soldiers. These professional forces formed the core of Cotys' military capabilities, providing reliable units that could be deployed according to strategic requirements rather than the seasonal and political constraints that had limited traditional Thracian military operations. The recruitment of Greek mercenaries represented a significant expansion of policies that had been initiated during earlier phases of Odrysian development, but Cotys implemented these arrangements with greater systematic attention to issues of integration, command structure, and long-term sustainability. The Greek mercenaries who entered Odrysian service during his reign came primarily from regions that had been devastated by the continuing conflicts between Greek city-states, including veterans of campaigns in Sicily, Asia Minor, and Egypt, who possessed extensive experience with diverse military systems and tactical approaches. The integration of Greek military expertise into Odrysian forces required careful attention to cultural and organizational challenges that could undermine military effectiveness if not properly managed. Cotys established separate command structures for Greek and Thracian units, while creating mechanisms for tactical coordination that allowed both groups to operate according to their strengths without compromising overall strategic objectives. Greek officers typically commanded siege operations and provided technical expertise for complex military engineering projects, while Thracian commanders retained authority over cavalry operations and campaigns in difficult terrain where traditional Thracian military advantages remained decisive. The development of siege warfare capabilities under Cotys represented perhaps the most significant military innovation of his reign, as the ability to capture fortified positions proved essential for the systematic reunification of territories that had been fragmented among numerous local strongmen. The construction and deployment of siege engines required technical knowledge and organizational capabilities that exceeded traditional Thracian military practices, but the investment in these capabilities provided decisive advantages in campaigns against rivals who lacked similar resources. The siege of Kabyle in 380 BC demonstrated the sophisticated military engineering capabilities that Cotys' forces had developed through their integration of Greek technical knowledge with Thracian organizational systems. Kabyle, located on a defensible hilltop overlooking the Tunja River, had served as the stronghold of a regional commander who controlled several tributary settlements and maintained independence through a combination of natural defensive advantages and diplomatic relationships with neighboring powers. The Odrysian siege works constructed around Kabyle included wooden towers that exceeded the height of the fortress walls, providing platforms for archers and artillery engines that could suppress defensive fire while protecting assault troops. The towers were mounted on wheels and protected by bronze-reinforced shields that enabled them to be moved close to the walls despite defensive countermeasures. Behind these mobile towers, Cotys engineers constructed permanent fortifications that prevented the garrison from receiving supplies or reinforcements, while providing secure bases for sustained operations. The fruit of Cotys' labor, the unified Odrysian realm, the disciplined armies, the overflowing treasuries, now lay scattered like seeds in a storm. His assassination had not merely ended a reign, it had shattered a dream. And into this vacuum of power, into this chaos of competing princes and fractured loyalties, stepped a figure whose ambition would reshape the entire ancient world, Philip II of Macedon. Philip was no ordinary king. He had spent his youth as a hostage in Thebes, where he had studied under the greatest military minds of Greece, absorbing their tactics, their strategies, their understanding of how wars were truly won. He had watched, learned, and waited. Now, returned to his homeland and seated upon the Macedonian throne, he began to implement a vision of conquest that would eventually carry his son Alexander to the ends of the known earth. But first, he needed to secure his northern borders. First, he needed to deal with the Thracians. The Odrysian Kingdom, weakened by civil war and succession disputes, presented both a threat and an opportunity. Philip understood that a unified Thrace under a strong king could challenge Macedonian expansion. But a divided Thrace, torn by internal conflicts, could be manipulated, exploited, and eventually absorbed. He chose his strategy with the cold precision of a surgeon: divide and conquer. Philip's first moves were diplomatic rather than military. He reached out to various Thracian princes, offering alliances, marriages, and promises of support against their rivals. He played faction against faction, tribe against tribe, brother against brother. Gold flowed from Macedonian coffers into Thracian hands, but it was gold that purchased not loyalty, but dependency. Each prince who accepted Philip's aid found himself increasingly bound to Macedonian interests, increasingly unable to act without Macedonian approval. The Odrysian royal family, still reeling from Cotys' death, found itself caught in Philip's web. Sitalces, Cotys' son and heir, struggled to maintain his father's legacy against both internal rivals and external pressure. He was young, inexperienced, and faced with challenges that would have tested even the most seasoned ruler. Philip exploited every weakness, every moment of hesitation, every mistake. In 357 BCE, Philip made his first major move against Thracian territory. He captured Amphipolis, a strategic city that controlled access to the gold and silver mines of Mount Pangaeon. This was no mere territorial acquisition, it was an economic masterstroke. The wealth that flowed from these mines would finance Philip's military reforms, his diplomatic initiatives, his eventual conquest of Greece itself, and it came at Thracian expense. Sitalces attempted to resist, to rally the Odrysian forces against this Macedonian aggression, but his kingdom was too divided, his resources too depleted, his allies too unreliable. Philip defeated each Thracian army that took the field against him, not through overwhelming force, but through superior tactics, better training, and the revolutionary military innovations he had introduced to the Macedonian army. The Sarissa, The 18-foot pike that would become the signature weapon of Macedonian warfare proved devastatingly effective against Thracian cavalry charges. The phalanx formation, refined and perfected by Philip, created an impenetrable wall of spear points that no Thracian assault could breach. And the companion cavalry, the elite mounted warriors who would later carry Alexander across Asia, demonstrated a mobility and striking power that Thracian horsemen, for all their legendary skill, could not match. Battle after battle, campaign after campaign, Philip pushed deeper into Thracian territory. He captured cities, established garrisons, and installed puppet rulers loyal to Macedonian interests. The Odrysian Kingdom, once the terror of the Balkans, found itself reduced to a shadow of its former glory, its independence increasingly nominal, its kings increasingly subservient to Macedonian will. Yet even in defeat, the Thracian spirit refused to die. Guerrilla resistance continued in the mountains and forests, where Macedonian phalanxes could not operate effectively. Tribal chiefs who had never fully accepted Odrysian rule now found common cause with their former overlords against the foreign invader, and Sitalces, despite his military failures, continued to seek allies, to plot resistance, to dream of restoration. Philip, recognizing that complete conquest would require resources better spent elsewhere, adopted a policy of indirect control. He allowed Sitalces to retain his throne, but stripped him of real power. Thracian tribute now flowed to Pella rather than to the Odrysian capital. Thracian warriors now served in Macedonian armies rather than their own. The kingdom survived in name, but its substance had been hollowed out, leaving only a shell. The psychological impact of this subjugation cannot be overstated. For generations, the Odrysians had been the dominant power in their region, the people before whom others trembled. Now they trembled before another. The warrior aristocracy that had built the kingdom found itself reduced to serving foreign masters. The priests who had proclaimed divine favor for Odrysian kings now struggled to explain why the gods had permitted such humiliation. Some Thracians adapted, finding places within the new Macedonian order. Thracian cavalry units became valued components of Philip's army, their skills in reconnaissance and skirmishing complementing Macedonian heavy infantry. Thracian nobles who accepted Macedonian supremacy found opportunities for advancement, wealth, and influence. The price was their independence, their identity, their pride. But for some, it was a price worth paying. Others refused to bend. In the remote highlands, in the dense forests, in the hidden valleys, resistance continued. These were not organized rebellions but persistent, grinding guerrilla warfare. Ambushes on supply convoys, assassinations of collaborators, raids on isolated garrisons. Philip could defeat Thracian armies in open battle, but he could not extinguish the Thracian will to resist. The year 342 BCE marked a turning point. Philip, preparing for his eventual confrontation with Athens and the Greek city-states, decided that he could no longer tolerate even nominal Thracian independence. He launched a massive campaign, the largest he had yet undertaken against Thrace, determined to achieve final, complete conquest. The campaign was brutal. Philip's armies swept through Thracian territory, crushing all resistance, destroying cities that refused to surrender, enslaving populations that dared to resist. Sitalces, finally cornered, was forced to surrender unconditionally. His kingdom was formally annexed to Macedon. Its separate existence ended after more than a century of independence. But Philip was not merely a destroyer, he was also a builder. In the heart of conquered Thrace, he founded a new city, Philippopolis, named after himself, designed to serve as the center of Macedonian administration in the region. This city, which would later become modern Plovdiv, represented Philip's vision for Thrace, a land integrated into the Macedonian sphere, its resources harnessed for Macedonian purposes, its people transformed into Macedonian subjects. The founding of Philippopolis was accompanied by massive population transfers. Greek and Macedonian settlers were brought in to establish a loyal population base. Thracian nobles who had resisted were killed or exiled. Those who had collaborated were rewarded with positions in the new administration. The goal was nothing less than the cultural transformation of Thrace, its absorption into the Hellenistic world that Philip was creating. Yet even this was not the end. As Philip turned his attention southward, toward Greece and the fateful battle of Chaeronea that would establish Macedonian hegemony over the Greek world, Thrace remained restive. The conquest had been military, not spiritual. Thracian identity, Thracian religion, Thracian customs, these survived beneath the surface of Macedonian rule, waiting for the moment when they might reassert themselves. That moment would come sooner than anyone expected. In 336 BCE, Philip II was assassinated at his daughter's wedding, struck down by a member of his own bodyguard. The circumstances remain mysterious to this day. Was it a personal grudge, a political conspiracy, or something else entirely? What is certain is that Philip's death threw the Macedonian world into chaos, creating opportunities for those who had suffered under his rule. Thrace erupted in rebellion. Tribes that had submitted to Philip now rose against his successor, the young Alexander. The new king, just 20 years old, faced challenges on every front. Greek cities seeking to throw off Macedonian control, Illyrian tribes raiding from the west, and now Thracian revolt in the north. Many doubted whether this untested youth could hold together the empire his father had built. They underestimated Alexander in a lightning campaign that demonstrated the military genius he would later display across Asia. Alexander crushed the Thracian rebellion with devastating efficiency. He crossed the Danube River, a feat that seemed impossible to his contemporaries, and defeated the Getae on their own territory, demonstrating that no enemy was beyond his reach. The Thracian tribes, awed by this display of power, submitted once again. But Alexander's ambitions lay elsewhere. Thrace was a sideshow, a distraction from the great enterprise he was planning, the invasion of the Persian Empire, the conquest of the known world. He needed Thrace pacified, not because he cared about the region itself, but because he could not afford to leave enemies in his rear when he marched east. The solution was characteristic of Alexander's approach: overwhelming force followed by pragmatic accommodation. Thracian resistance was crushed, but Thracian institutions were largely preserved. Local rulers who accepted Macedonian supremacy were allowed to retain their positions. Thracian warriors were recruited into Alexander's army, where they would serve with distinction in campaigns from Egypt to India. The goal was not to destroy Thrace, but to harness it. As Alexander's army marched east in 334 BCE, crossing into Asia to begin the campaign that would create the largest empire the world had yet seen, Thracian contingents marched with them. These warriors, descendants of the fierce tribes that had once terrorized Greece, now served a Macedonian king in a war of conquest that would reshape human history. It was a strange fate for a proud people, but it was not the end of their story, for even as Thracian warriors helped Alexander conquer Persia, even as they fought and died on battlefields from Granicus to Gaugamela, the flame of Thracian independence continued to flicker. In the mountains of their homeland, in the memories of their people, in the rituals of their religion, the Odrysian legacy survived. And when Alexander's empire eventually crumbled, when his successors turned on each other in wars of succession that would last for generations, Thrace would find new opportunities to reassert itself. The shadow of Macedon was long and dark, but shadows by their nature are temporary. The sun that cast them would eventually set, and when it did, new powers would rise to take their place. Among them, against all odds, would be the Odrysian Kingdom, reborn from the ashes of conquest, ready to write new chapters in its long and turbulent history. Alexander died in Babylon in 323 BCE, just 32 years old, his empire stretching from Greece to India, his legend already assuming mythic proportions. When asked on his deathbed to whom he left his kingdom, he reportedly answered, "To the strongest." It was an answer that would plunge the ancient world into decades of devastating warfare. The wars of the Diadochi, the successors, were among the most complex and brutal conflicts in ancient history. Alexander's generals, each commanding portions of his vast army, each controlling territories he had conquered, turned on each other with a ferocity that shocked even their contemporaries. Alliances formed and dissolved with dizzying speed. Betrayals became commonplace. Entire kingdoms rose and fell in the space of years. For Thrace, this chaos represented both danger and opportunity. The region found itself caught between competing Macedonian factions, each seeking to control its strategic position and its military resources. But the very intensity of these conflicts meant that no single power could establish lasting dominance. In the spaces between the great powers, in the moments when their attention was directed elsewhere, Thracian independence could reassert itself. The first years after Alexander's death saw Thrace nominally under the control of Lysimachus, one of Alexander's bodyguards who had been assigned the region as his portion of the divided empire. Lysimachus was a capable general and an ambitious ruler, but he faced challenges on every front. To the south, other successors contested his claims. To the north, Celtic tribes were beginning their great migration that would eventually bring them into the heart of the ancient world. And within Thrace itself, the native population remained restive, ready to exploit any sign of weakness. Lysimachus adopted a policy of careful consolidation. He strengthened the fortifications of key cities, established new military colonies, and worked to integrate Thracian warriors into his army. He understood that he could not rule Thrace through force alone. He needed at least the acquiescence, if not the active support, of the local population. This meant accommodating Thracian customs, respecting Thracian religion, and allowing Thracian nobles a degree of autonomy within his system. The Odrysian royal family, reduced but not eliminated by Macedonian conquest, found a place within this new order. Sitalces III, a descendant of the ancient royal line, emerged as a key figure in this period. He had served in Alexander's army, fighting in the great campaigns that had conquered Persia. Now he returned to his homeland with military experience, political connections, and ambitions of his own. Sitalces' relationship with Lysimachus was complex and often contentious. On one hand, he recognized that open rebellion against Macedonian power was futile. The successors, for all their conflicts with each other, remained militarily superior to any force Thrace could muster. On the other hand, he was determined to preserve as much Thracian autonomy as possible, to maintain the traditions and institutions of his ancestors, to keep alive the dream of eventual independence. The result was a delicate dance of cooperation and resistance. Sitalces provided troops for Lysimachus's campaigns, fulfilled his obligations as a subordinate ruler, and maintained the outward forms of loyalty. But he also built his own power base, cultivated relationships with other Thracian leaders, and quietly prepared for the day when circumstances might allow more assertive action. That day came in 313 BCE, when Lysimachus found himself embroiled in a major war against Antigonus, another of the successors who was attempting to reunify Alexander's empire under his own rule. With Lysimachus's attention and forces directed southward, Suedes saw his opportunity. He raised the standard of rebellion, rallying Thracian tribes to his cause, and declared the restoration of Odrysian independence. The rebellion was initially successful. Suedes' forces, fighting on familiar terrain against garrisons weakened by troop withdrawals, won several significant victories. Cities that had been under Macedonian control for decades welcomed Thracian liberators. For a brief, glorious moment, it seemed that the Odrysian Kingdom might truly be reborn. But Lysimachus, whatever his other faults, was not a man to accept such defiance. Despite the pressures of his war against Antigonus, he gathered a force and marched against Suedes. The campaign that followed was hard-fought and bloody. Suedes, knowing he could not match Macedonian forces in open battle, adopted guerrilla tactics, ambushes, raids, strategic withdrawals. He made Lysimachus pay for every mile of Thracian territory. The decisive engagement came at a location whose name has been lost to history. Suedes, forced finally to give battle, arranged his forces with skill born of long experience. The Thracian cavalry, still among the finest in the ancient world, anchored his flanks. His infantry, though less disciplined than Macedonian phalanxes, fought with the desperate courage of men defending their homeland. For hours, the battle hung in the balance. In the end, Macedonian training and equipment proved decisive. Lysimachus's phalanx broke the Thracian center, and his cavalry, pursuing the routed enemy, turned defeat into disaster. Suedes himself barely escaped with his life, fleeing into the mountains with the remnants of his army. But here, the story takes an unexpected turn. Lysimachus, rather than pursuing Suedes to destruction, offered terms. The reasons were pragmatic. He could not afford a prolonged guerrilla war in Thrace while facing threats elsewhere. But the terms themselves were remarkably generous. Suedes was allowed to retain his position as a subordinate king, ruling a portion of Thrace under Macedonian suzerainty. The Odrysian royal line would continue. Suedes accepted. He had no real choice. Continued resistance would only bring more destruction to his people. But he used the years of peace that followed to rebuild, to strengthen, to prepare. He founded a new capital city, Sitalces, designed to serve as the center of Odrysian culture and administration. Archaeological excavations of this site have revealed a sophisticated urban center, with Greek-style architecture adapted to Thracian needs, evidence of a flourishing economy, and signs of a vibrant cultural life. Sitalces represented Suedes' vision for his people's future, a Thrace that could absorb the best of Greek civilization while maintaining its own identity. The city featured temples to both Greek and Thracian gods, markets where Greek merchants traded alongside Thracian craftsmen, and a palace that combined Hellenistic elegance with traditional Thracian symbolism. It was a statement of cultural confidence, a declaration that Thracian civilization could stand alongside Greek civilization as an equal. The years that followed saw Suedes walking a careful line between accommodation and resistance. He fulfilled his obligations to Lysimachus, providing troops and tribute as required, but he also maintained connections with other Thracian leaders, preserved traditional institutions, and quietly built his military strength. When Lysimachus's attention was elsewhere, Suedes expanded his influence. When Macedonian pressure increased, he retreated to the forms of submission. This delicate balance was disrupted by the Great Celtic Invasion of 280 to 279 BCE. Massive Celtic tribes, driven by pressures in their Central European homelands, swept down through the Balkans in a migration that would reshape the region's demographics and politics. They defeated one army after another, killed Ptolemy Ceraunus, who had succeeded Lysimachus as ruler of Macedon, and even threatened Greece itself, before being finally stopped at Delphi. For Thrace, the Celtic invasion was catastrophic. The invaders swept through the region, destroying cities, massacring populations, and disrupting the political order that had existed for generations. Sitalces itself may have been destroyed in this period. The archaeological evidence suggests a violent end to the city's existence. The careful work of decades was undone in months, but the Celts, for all their military prowess, were not empire builders. They settled in portions of Thrace, establishing the kingdom of Sitalces, but they did not attempt to impose unified control over the entire region. This created a new political landscape, more fragmented than before, but also offering new opportunities for those who could navigate its complexities. The Odrysian Kingdom, or what remained of it, survived the Celtic storm. Reduced in territory, diminished in power, but still existing, still maintaining the royal line, still preserving the traditions of their ancestors. In the decades that followed, Odrysian kings would continue to rule portions of Thrace, sometimes as independent monarchs, sometimes as clients of greater powers, always struggling to maintain their identity in a world that seemed determined to absorb them. The wars of the successors had demonstrated both the resilience and the limitations of Thracian independence. The Odrysians could survive, could even occasionally thrive, but they could not escape the gravitational pull of the great powers that surrounded them. Their future would be shaped not by their own choices alone, but by the decisions of kings and generals in distant capitals, by wars fought for reasons that had nothing to do with Thrace, by forces beyond their control. Yet even in this constrained existence, there was a kind of dignity. The Odrysians had not surrendered their identity, had not allowed themselves to be simply absorbed into the Hellenistic world. They had adapted, compromised, and sometimes submitted, but they had survived. And survival, in the brutal world of the ancient Mediterranean, was no small achievement. The 3rd century BCE was a time of slow decline for the Odrysian Kingdom, a gradual fading rather than a dramatic collapse. The great days of Teres and Sitalces, of Cotys and his golden court, seemed impossibly distant now. The kingdom that had once stretched from the Danube to the Aegean, that had fielded armies of 150,000 warriors, that had made the mightiest powers of Greece tremble, that kingdom existed now only in memory and legend. What remained was a rump state, a shadow of former glory, ruled by kings whose names are barely remembered, whose deeds went largely unrecorded. The sources for this period are frustratingly sparse. A few inscriptions, scattered references in Greek and Roman texts, archaeological evidence that raises more questions than it answers. We know that Odrysian kings continued to rule, continued to mint coins bearing their names and titles, continued to maintain at least the forms of royal authority. But the substance of that authority had largely evaporated. The kingdom's territory had shrunk dramatically. The coastal regions, with their wealthy Greek cities, had long since passed under other control. The rich agricultural lands of the river valleys were contested by Celtic settlers, rival Thracian tribes, and the expanding power of Macedon. What remained to the Odrysians was primarily the mountainous interior, defensible certainly, but poor in resources and isolated from the main currents of Mediterranean trade and culture. Yet even in decline, the Odrysian kings maintained certain traditions. They continued to claim descent from the ancient royal line, tracing their ancestry back to Teres and beyond. They continued to perform the religious rituals that legitimized their rule, to maintain the sacred sites where their ancestors had communed with the gods. They continued to style themselves as kings, to maintain courts, however modest, to exercise what authority they could over their diminished domains. The relationship with Macedon remained central to Odrysian survival. After the chaos of the Celtic invasions, Macedon had gradually reasserted its dominance over the region, though never as completely as in Philip II's day. The Antigonid dynasty, which now ruled Macedon, pursued a policy of indirect control, allowing local rulers to maintain their positions as long as they acknowledged Macedonian supremacy and provided military support when required. For the Odrysian kings, this arrangement offered a measure of security. Macedonian protection shielded them from rival Thracian tribes, from Celtic raiders, from the various threats that surrounded their diminished kingdom. The price was subordination, the acceptance of a status that their ancestors would have found humiliating. But in the harsh calculus of survival, it was a price worth paying. The cultural life of the kingdom continued, though in diminished form. Thracian craftsmen still produced the distinctive metalwork for which their people were famous: gold and silver vessels, elaborate jewelry, decorated weapons and armor. These objects, many of which have survived to the present day, reveal a culture that remained vibrant even in political decline. The artistic traditions of centuries were maintained, adapted, and passed on to new generations. Religion, too, remained a vital force. The Thracian gods, Sabazios, Bendis, the Thracian rider, continued to receive worship, their cults maintained by priests who preserved ancient rituals and sacred knowledge. The mystery religions that had originated in Thrace continued to spread throughout the Mediterranean world, carrying Thracian spiritual traditions far beyond the borders of the diminished kingdom. In this sense, at least, Thracian influence actually expanded even as Thracian political power contracted. The royal tombs of this period, though less magnificent than those of earlier centuries, still demonstrate considerable wealth and sophisticated craftsmanship. Kings were still buried with grave goods appropriate to their status: weapons, jewelry, vessels for food and drink in the afterlife. The belief in an afterlife, in the continuation of royal dignity beyond death, remained strong. Whatever humiliations the living kings might suffer, they would enter eternity as true monarchs. The mid-3rd century saw a brief revival of Odrysian fortunes. A king named Cotys, the name itself a connection to the glorious past, managed to expand his territory and increase his independence from Macedonian control. The sources are too fragmentary to reconstruct his reign in detail, but inscriptions and coins suggest a ruler of some ambition and capability. For a generation it seemed that the Odrysian Kingdom might yet recover something of its former significance, but this revival proved temporary. The pressures that had reduced the kingdom remained in force: the power of Macedon, the presence of Celtic settlers, the competition from rival Thracian tribes. Cotys' successors were unable to maintain his gains, and the kingdom slipped back into its pattern of diminished existence, surviving but not thriving, enduring but not flourishing. The late 3rd century brought new challenges. Rome, the rising power of the Western Mediterranean, was beginning to extend its influence eastward. The wars between Rome and Macedon, which would eventually result in the destruction of the Antigonid dynasty and the incorporation of Greece into the Roman sphere, created new uncertainties for all the peoples of the Balkans. The Odrysian kings, like other regional rulers, had to navigate an increasingly complex diplomatic landscape, balancing between powers whose conflicts could easily sweep away small kingdoms caught in between. The first direct Roman involvement in Thracian affairs came during the Second Macedonian War, 200 to 197 BCE. Rome, seeking allies against Philip V of Macedon, reached out to various Thracian tribes and rulers. The Odrysians, seeing an opportunity to escape Macedonian dominance, provided support to the Roman cause. It was a fateful decision, one that would shape the kingdom's future in ways that could not then be foreseen. Rome's victory over Macedon transformed the political landscape of the Eastern Mediterranean. Philip V was forced to abandon his territories outside Macedon proper, creating a power vacuum that various parties rushed to fill. For the Odrysians, this seemed to offer an opportunity for expansion, for recovery of territories lost generations before. But the reality proved more complicated. Rome, having defeated Macedon, had no intention of allowing a new regional power to emerge in its place. Roman diplomacy worked to keep the Balkans divided, to prevent any single state from becoming strong enough to challenge Roman interests. The Odrysians found themselves caught in a web of Roman manipulation, their attempts at expansion blocked, their independence constrained by a power even greater than Macedon had been. The following decade saw the Odrysian Kingdom reduced to the status of a Roman client state. The kings retained their titles, their courts, their formal authority, but real power increasingly lay with Rome. Roman ambassadors arrived with advice that could not be refused. Roman merchants penetrated Thracian markets. Roman cultural influences began to reshape Thracian society. The process was gradual, almost imperceptible at times, but its direction was unmistakable. Yet even in this twilight period, moments of resistance occurred. In 188 BCE, a Thracian king named Amadocus led a rebellion against Roman influence, rallying tribes who resented foreign interference in their affairs. The rebellion was crushed, as such rebellions inevitably were, but it demonstrated that the Thracian spirit of independence had not been entirely extinguished. The flame burned low, but it still burned. The kingdom's final century was a slow fade into irrelevance. Kings succeeded kings, each more obscure than the last, each ruling a smaller territory with less real authority. The great traditions of the Odrysian past became increasingly distant memories, preserved in ritual and legend but disconnected from present reality. The kingdom that had once been the greatest power in the Balkans was now barely a footnote in the histories of greater powers. And yet, the Odrysian Kingdom still existed. Through all the conquests and catastrophes, through all the humiliations and diminishments, the royal line continued. Kings still sat on the throne that Teres had established, still claimed the authority that Sitalces had wielded, still dreamed, perhaps, of restoration and revival. It was a remarkable persistence, a testament to the tenacity of tradition and the power of identity. The long twilight was drawing to a close, but before the final darkness fell, there would be one last chapter, one final act in the drama of the Odrysian Kingdom. And that chapter would be written not by Thracians, but by the power that was reshaping the entire Mediterranean world, Rome. The Roman Republic, by the middle of the 2nd century BCE, had become the dominant power in the Mediterranean world. Carthage had been destroyed, Macedon conquered, the Greek city-states reduced to effective vassalage. Now Rome's attention turned to the regions that lay beyond its direct control, including Thrace, that ancient land of warriors and gold, of mystery cults and fierce independence. Rome's approach to Thrace was characteristically pragmatic. Direct conquest and provincial administration would require significant military resources and ongoing commitment. Far better, from Rome's perspective, to rule through client kings, local rulers who would maintain order, collect tribute, and provide military support when needed, all while bearing the costs and complications of actual governance. The Odrysian kings, with their ancient legitimacy and their experience of subordination to greater powers, seemed ideal candidates for this role. The transformation of the Odrysian Kingdom into a Roman client state was gradual but inexorable. Roman advisors appeared at the royal court, offering guidance that could not be refused. Roman merchants established themselves in Thracian markets, their activities protected by the implicit threat of Roman military power. Roman cultural influences, language, dress, architecture, customs, began to penetrate Thracian society, particularly among the elite who sought Roman favor. The kings who ruled during this period faced an impossible dilemma. Resistance to Rome meant destruction. The fate of Macedon, of Carthage, of so many others who had dared to challenge Roman power, made this abundantly clear. But accommodation meant the gradual erosion of everything that made the Odrysian Kingdom distinctive, the slow absorption into a Roman world that had no place for independent Thracian identity. Most chose accommodation, or at least the appearance of it. They adopted Roman names alongside their Thracian ones, sent their sons to Rome for education, embraced Roman customs and culture. They became, in effect, Romanized Thracians, or Thracianized Romans, depending on one's perspective. The distinction between ruler and ruled, between Thracian and Roman, became increasingly blurred. But beneath this surface of accommodation, tensions simmered. The common people of Thrace, less exposed to Roman influence than their rulers, maintained traditional ways of life, traditional beliefs, traditional resentments. The warrior aristocracy, whose identity was bound up with military prowess and independence, chafed under a system that reduced them to auxiliaries in Roman armies, fighting Roman wars for Roman purposes. The priests, guardians of ancient religious traditions, watched with dismay as Roman cults and Roman gods gained adherents among the elite. These tensions erupted periodically in rebellions, desperate doomed uprisings that Rome crushed with brutal efficiency. Each rebellion brought harsher Roman responses, increased military presence, tighter political control, more extensive confiscations of land and wealth. The cycle of resistance and repression gradually wore down Thracian independence, each iteration leaving the kingdom weaker, more dependent, more thoroughly subordinated to Roman will. The 1st century BCE brought new complications. Rome itself was convulsed by civil wars, as ambitious generals, Marius and Sulla, Pompey and Caesar, Antony and Octavian, fought for supremacy. These conflicts spilled over into the provinces and client states, forcing local rulers to choose sides in struggles whose outcomes they could not predict. Choose wrongly, and destruction followed. Choose rightly, and rewards might come. But the next civil war might reverse everything. The Odrysian kings navigated these treacherous waters with varying degrees of success. Some backed the wrong faction and paid the price. Others managed to switch allegiances at opportune moments, preserving their positions through the chaos. The kingdom survived, but each crisis left it more diminished, more dependent, more clearly a pawn in games played by others. The reign of Augustus, which brought peace to the Roman world after decades of civil war, also brought a new phase in Rome's relationship with Thrace. Augustus, reorganizing the empire's frontiers and client relationships, confirmed the Odrysian kings in their position, but made clear the limits of their authority. They ruled at Rome's pleasure, for Rome's purposes, subject to Rome's ultimate control. The fiction of independence was maintained, but it was increasingly transparent as fiction. The early 1st century CE saw the final generation of Odrysian kings. These rulers, Sitalces I, Cotys VIII, Sitalces II, and others, were thoroughly Romanized figures, more comfortable in Rome than in their own kingdom, more familiar with Latin literature than with Thracian traditions. They were clients in the fullest sense, their authority derived from Roman recognition, their policies shaped by Roman interests, their very identities hybrid constructions that belonged fully to neither world. Sitalces I, who ruled in the early years of Augustus's reign, exemplified this hybrid identity. He had been educated in Rome, had served in Roman armies, had absorbed Roman culture to the point where he was barely distinguishable from a Roman aristocrat. Yet he also maintained Thracian traditions, patronized Thracian religion, and styled himself as heir to the ancient Odrysian legacy. He was, in his own person, the meeting point of two civilizations, and the living symbol of Thracian subordination to Roman power. His reign was marked by the familiar pattern of accommodation, punctuated by crisis. He supported Augustus loyally, providing troops for Roman campaigns, maintaining order in his kingdom, serving as a reliable buffer on Rome's Balkan frontier. In return, he received Roman support against internal rivals and external threats, Roman recognition of his royal status, Roman tolerance of his continued rule. But even Sitalces could not entirely suppress Thracian resistance. In 11 BCE, a major rebellion erupted, led by Thracians who rejected both Roman domination and the collaborationist policies of their king. The rebels achieved initial successes, defeating Roman forces and threatening to overturn the entire system of client rule. Sitalces, caught between his Roman patrons and his Thracian subjects, found himself in an impossible position. The rebellion was eventually crushed, as such rebellions always were. Roman legions, summoned from neighboring provinces, restored order with characteristic efficiency and brutality. The rebel leaders were killed or captured, their followers enslaved or scattered. Sitalces retained his throne, but the episode demonstrated the fragility of his position. Dependent on Roman support against his own people, ruling a kingdom that increasingly existed only at Roman sufferance. The succession struggles that followed Sitalces' death further weakened the kingdom. His heirs fought among themselves, each faction seeking Roman support against the others. Rome, following its usual policy, encouraged these divisions, playing rivals against each other to prevent any single ruler from becoming too strong or too independent. The kingdom was repeatedly divided and reunited, its territories parceled out among competing claimants, its coherence as a political entity progressively undermined. The final crisis came in 46 CE, during the reign of the Emperor Claudius. Sitalces III, the last Odrysian king, was murdered by his wife, an act that may have been motivated by personal grievances, political ambitions, or Roman manipulation. The circumstances remain unclear, but the consequences were decisive. Claudius, citing the instability of the kingdom and the need for direct Roman administration, announced the annexation of Thrace as a Roman province. The announcement was almost anticlimactic. The Odrysian Kingdom had been a Roman client state for so long, its independence so thoroughly compromised, that formal annexation changed relatively little in practical terms. Roman administrators replaced Thracian kings, Roman law replaced Thracian custom, Roman institutions replaced Thracian traditions. But these changes had been underway for generations. The annexation merely formalized what had long been reality. And yet the symbolic significance was profound. The Odrysian Kingdom, which had endured for over 4 centuries, which had survived Macedonian conquest and Celtic invasion and Roman domination, finally ceased to exist. The royal line that traced its ancestry back to Teres, that had produced Sitalces and Cotys and so many others, came to an end. A chapter of history closed, never to be reopened. The Thracian people, of course, continued to exist. They lived under Roman rule, adapted to Roman ways, served in Roman armies, worshipped in Roman temples. Over generations they became Romans themselves, or rather, they became part of that vast, diverse population that constituted the Roman Empire. Their distinctive identity faded, merged into the larger whole, preserved only in scattered traditions, obscure cults, and the archaeological remains that modern scholars would one day unearth. But something was lost that could never be recovered. The Odrysian Kingdom, for all its flaws and failures, had represented something unique, a Thracian state, ruled by Thracian kings, expressing Thracian values and traditions. Its destruction meant the end of Thracian political independence, the absorption of Thracian identity into a larger, more powerful civilization. The warriors who had once made Greece tremble now served as auxiliaries in Roman legions. The kings who had once treated with Athens and Macedon as equals now existed only in memory and legend. Rome's iron embrace had finally closed around Thrace. The ancient kingdom was no more. The Odrysian Kingdom died in 46 CE, but its echoes continued to reverberate through the centuries that followed. In the religious practices of the Roman Empire, in the military traditions of Byzantine armies, in the folk memories of Balkan peoples, traces of the ancient Thracian civilization persisted, transformed but not entirely erased. The most enduring legacy was religious. The mystery cults that had originated in Thrace, the worship of Dionysus, the rites of Orpheus, the cult of Sabazios, spread throughout the Roman world, attracting adherents from every social class and every corner of the empire. These cults offered something that traditional Roman religion could not: personal salvation, direct experience of the divine, the promise of blessed afterlife. In an age of uncertainty and spiritual hunger, such promises held powerful appeal. The Orphic mysteries in particular achieved remarkable influence. Orpheus, the legendary Thracian singer whose music could charm wild beasts and move stones, became a symbol of the soul's journey through death to eternal life. The myths associated with him, his descent to the underworld to rescue his beloved Eurydice, his death at the hands of Maenads, his continued singing even after his head was severed from his body, spoke to deep human longings for love, for meaning, for transcendence. Early Christianity, emerging in this same spiritual environment, absorbed and transformed many Orphic themes. The image of Christ as the Good Shepherd, leading his flock to salvation, echoed Orpheus charming the animals with his music. The descent to hell and harrowing of the underworld paralleled Orpheus's journey to rescue Eurydice. The promise of resurrection and eternal life spoke to the same hopes that had drawn people to the Orphic mysteries. In this way, Thracian religious traditions flowed into the mainstream of Western spirituality, their origins largely forgotten, but their influence enduring. The cult of the Thracian rider, that mysterious mounted figure who appeared on countless Thracian monuments, also persisted into the Roman and Byzantine periods. Transformed and reinterpreted, the rider became associated with various Roman deities, with Christian saints, with folk heroes of later Balkan tradition. The image of the mounted warrior, protector and savior, proved remarkably adaptable, capable of carrying new meanings while retaining its essential power. In military matters too, Thracian traditions left their mark. Thracian cavalry units served in Roman armies throughout the imperial period. Their skills in reconnaissance, skirmishing, and light cavalry tactics highly valued by Roman commanders. The distinctive Thracian equipment, the curved sword called the sica, the crescent-shaped shield called the pelta, the characteristic helmet with its high crest, influenced Roman military fashion and equipment design. The gladiatorial arena preserved Thracian martial traditions in a particularly vivid, if gruesome, form. The Threx, or Thracian gladiator, was one of the standard types in Roman gladiatorial combat, armed with the traditional Thracian weapons and fighting in a style derived from Thracian warfare. These gladiators, whether actually Thracian or merely adopting Thracian equipment and techniques, kept alive a memory of Thracian military prowess long after the kingdom itself had ceased to exist. The province of Thrace under Roman and later Byzantine rule retained certain distinctive characteristics. The population remained ethnically mixed, with Thracian elements persisting alongside Greek and Roman settlers. Local traditions, local cults, local customs survived beneath the surface of imperial administration. The land itself, the mountains and valleys, the rivers and forests, remained unchanged, shaping the lives of those who inhabited it in ways that transcended political boundaries. The great migrations of late antiquity brought new peoples to Thrace: Goths, Huns, Slavs, Bulgars, each wave adding new elements to the region's complex ethnic and cultural mix. The Thracian identity, already diluted by centuries of Roman rule, was further submerged beneath these new influences. By the medieval period, Thracian had become primarily a geographical rather than ethnic designation, referring to a region rather than a people. Yet even then, echoes persisted. Bulgarian folklore preserved traditions that scholars have traced back to ancient Thracian origins. The Kukari rituals, with their elaborate costumes and their connections to fertility and the agricultural cycle, bear striking resemblances to ancient Thracian religious practices. The veneration of certain mountains and springs, the beliefs about supernatural beings inhabiting the natural world, the customs surrounding death and burial, all these carried forward elements of the ancient Thracian worldview, transformed but recognizable. The archaeological rediscovery of Thracian civilization, beginning in the 19th century and continuing to the present day, has brought the Odrysian Kingdom back into historical consciousness. The spectacular tomb finds, the golden treasures of Panagurishte and Rogosin, the painted tombs of Kazanlak and Sveshtari, the royal burial at Sitalces, have revealed a civilization of remarkable sophistication and artistic achievement. These discoveries have challenged earlier assumptions about Thracian barbarism, demonstrating that the Odrysians created a culture worthy of comparison with their Greek and Persian contemporaries. Modern Bulgaria, whose territory encompasses much of the ancient Odrysian heartland, has embraced this Thracian heritage as part of its national identity. Museums display Thracian artifacts, schools teach Thracian history, and the ancient Thracians are celebrated as ancestors of the modern Bulgarian nation. This connection is historically problematic. The relationship between ancient Thracians and modern Bulgarians is complex and contested, but it demonstrates the continuing power of the Odrysian legacy to shape contemporary identities. The story of the Odrysian Kingdom, viewed from the perspective of more than 2 millennia, offers lessons that remain relevant today. It is a story of rise and fall, of glory and decline, of the eternal struggle between independence and domination. It demonstrates how even the mightiest kingdoms can be brought low by internal divisions, external pressures, and the inexorable forces of historical change. But it also shows how cultural traditions can persist long after political structures have crumbled, how the achievements of a civilization can echo through centuries, how the human spirit can find ways to endure even in the face of conquest and absorption. The Odrysian kings are dust now, their palaces ruins, their armies scattered to the winds of time. But something of what they built, something of what they believed, something of what they were, this survives, in the gold work that gleams in museum cases, in the religious traditions that shaped Western spirituality, in the folk customs of Balkan villages, in the very landscape of the region they once ruled. The Odrysians live on. Their kingdom may have fallen, but their legacy endures. To understand the Odrysian Kingdom fully, one must understand its relationship with gold. This was not merely an economic matter, though the economic dimensions were significant. Gold, for the Thracians, carried meanings that transcended its material value. Spiritual meanings, political meanings, meanings that shaped every aspect of their civilization. The Thracian lands were rich in gold. The rivers that flowed down from the mountains carried gold dust in their waters, deposited over millennia by geological processes that the ancients did not understand but certainly appreciated. The mountains themselves contained gold-bearing ores, which Thracian miners extracted using techniques passed down through generations. This natural abundance made gold central to Thracian culture in ways that distinguished it from neighboring civilizations. For the Greeks, gold was primarily a medium of exchange, a store of value, a material for luxury goods. For the Persians, it was a symbol of imperial power, accumulated in vast treasuries to demonstrate the great king's wealth and might. But for the Thracians, gold was something more. A sacred substance, imbued with divine power, capable of connecting the human and supernatural worlds. The gold objects found in Thracian tombs are not merely beautiful, they are theological statements. The intricate decorations, scenes of hunting and warfare, images of gods and mythical creatures, abstract patterns of profound symbolic significance, were not random artistic choices, but carefully considered expressions of religious belief. Each object was created not just to display wealth, but to serve specific ritual purposes, to accompany the dead on their journey to the afterlife, to ensure their continued existence in the world beyond. The craftsmanship of Thracian goldsmiths was extraordinary, working with techniques that modern metallurgists still struggle to fully understand. They created objects of stunning beauty and technical sophistication. The Panagurishte treasure, discovered in 1949, includes vessels whose thin walls and elaborate decoration represent the highest achievements of ancient metalworking. The Rogozin treasure, found in 1985, contains over 160 silver vessels, many gilded, demonstrating the scale and quality of Thracian precious metalwork. These treasures were not merely accumulated wealth, they were active participants in the political and religious life of the kingdom. Royal feasts, at which gold and silver vessels were displayed and used, served to demonstrate the king's power and generosity. Gift-giving, using precious metal objects, created bonds of obligation and loyalty that held the kingdom together. The burial of such objects with deceased kings ensured their status in the afterlife, while also removing wealth from circulation, preventing it from being used by rivals or successors. The gold trade connected Thrace to the wider Mediterranean world. Greek merchants came seeking Thracian gold, offering in exchange the products of Greek civilization: wine, olive oil, pottery, textiles. This trade brought not just goods, but ideas, artistic influences, and cultural connections. The distinctive style of Thracian goldwork, which combined indigenous traditions with Greek, Persian, and Scythian influences, emerged from these commercial and cultural exchanges. The Odrysian kings understood the political power of gold. They used it to reward loyal followers, to purchase the allegiance of wavering allies, to bribe enemies into neutrality or friendship. The tribute they collected from subject peoples was often paid in gold, which then flowed outward again in the form of gifts, payments, and diplomatic inducements. Gold was the lubricant that kept the machinery of the kingdom running smoothly, but gold was also a source of vulnerability. The wealth of Thrace attracted the attention of more powerful neighbors, Macedon, Rome, and others who coveted Thracian resources. The gold mines of Mount Pangaean, captured by Philip II, financed Macedonian expansion and helped create the empire that would eventually conquer the known world. Thracian gold, in a sense, funded its own subjugation. The religious significance of gold persisted even as political circumstances changed. Under Macedonian rule, under Roman rule, Thracian craftsmen continued to create gold objects for ritual purposes. The techniques were passed down, the traditions maintained, the sacred meanings preserved. Even when Thracian kings no longer ruled, Thracian gold continued to speak of Thracian beliefs and values. The tomb treasures that have been discovered in modern times represent only a fraction of what once existed. Ancient tomb robbers, medieval treasure hunters, and modern looters have destroyed or dispersed countless objects. What survives in museums and collections is the remnant of a remnant, tantalizing glimpses of a wealth that must have been almost unimaginable. Yet even these remnants are enough to demonstrate the sophistication and power of Thracian civilization. The gold speaks across the millennia, telling stories of kings and warriors, of gods and rituals, of a people who found in this precious metal a way to express their deepest beliefs and highest aspirations. The weight of gold, for the Odrysians, was the weight of meaning itself. And so we come to the end of our journey through the history of the Odrysian Kingdom, a journey that has taken us across 4 centuries, from the unification achieved by Teres to the annexation decreed by Cotys, from the heights of power under Sitalces to the depths of subjugation under Rome. What lessons can we draw from this long and complex story? What meaning can we find in the rise and fall of this ancient civilization? The first lesson is about the nature of power itself. The Odrysian Kingdom rose because Teres and his successors understood how to accumulate and wield power through military force, through diplomatic skill, through the manipulation of tribal loyalties and religious beliefs. They created a state where none had existed before, imposing order on chaos, unity on fragmentation. This was a remarkable achievement, one that required vision, determination, and no small amount of ruthlessness. But power, once accumulated, must be constantly maintained. The Odrysian kings discovered, as rulers throughout history have discovered, that holding power is often harder than seizing it. Internal divisions, succession disputes, the ambitions of subordinates, the resentments of subject peoples, all these threatened to tear apart what had been so laboriously constructed. The kingdom's history is punctuated by civil wars, rebellions, and periods of fragmentation, each one weakening the state and making it more vulnerable to external threats. The second lesson concerns the relationship between small powers and great ones. The Odrysian Kingdom, at its height, was a significant regional power, but it was never a great power in the sense that Persia, Macedon, or Rome were great powers. It existed in a world dominated by larger, more powerful states, and its fate was ultimately determined by forces beyond its control. The kings could maneuver, could play one great power against another, could seek advantage in the conflicts of their betters, but they could not escape the fundamental asymmetry of power that defined their situation. This is a lesson with contemporary relevance. Small and medium-sized states today face similar challenges, navigating a world shaped by great power competition, seeking to preserve their independence and identity while accommodating the realities of power. The strategies employed by the Odrysian kings, alliance, accommodation, occasional resistance, the cultivation of useful niches, are strategies still employed by states in similar positions today. The third lesson is about cultural survival. The Odrysian Kingdom was conquered, absorbed, and eventually forgotten, but Thracian culture persisted in transformed forms long after the political structures had crumbled. Religious traditions, artistic styles, folk customs, and collective memories carried forward elements of Thracian civilization into new contexts and new eras. Culture, it seems, is more resilient than politics, more enduring than states and empires. This persistence raises profound questions about identity and continuity. What does it mean for a civilization to survive? If the political structures are destroyed but the cultural traditions continue, has the civilization truly ended? If the people are absorbed into larger populations but their beliefs and practices persist, have they truly disappeared? The Odrysian case suggests that civilizations can die and yet somehow continue to live, their essence preserved even as their forms are transformed. The fourth lesson concerns the importance of memory. The Odrysian Kingdom was largely forgotten for nearly 2 millennia, its history preserved only in fragmentary references in Greek and Roman texts, its achievements buried beneath the accumulated layers of subsequent civilizations. The archaeological discoveries of the 19th and 20th centuries brought it back into historical consciousness, revealing a civilization far more sophisticated and significant than earlier scholars had imagined. This recovery of memory matters. It enriches our understanding of the ancient world, challenging simplistic narratives that privilege Greek and Roman civilization at the expense of their neighbors. It provides modern Bulgarians and others with a deeper sense of their historical heritage. And it reminds us that history is not fixed but constantly being revised, that civilizations once forgotten can be rediscovered, that the past is never entirely past. The final lesson is perhaps the most profound. The Odrysian Kingdom, like all human creations, was temporary. It rose, flourished, declined, and fell. The kings who built it, the warriors who fought for it, the priests who sanctified it, the craftsmen who adorned it, all are dust now, their individual lives forgotten, their personal hopes and fears lost to time. And yet, something remains. The gold objects in museum cases, the ruins of ancient cities, the traces of religious traditions and later practices, the very landscape shaped by Thracian hands. These are the residue of lives lived, of efforts made, of a civilization that once was. This is the human condition. We build, knowing that what we build will not last forever. We strive, knowing that our strivings will eventually be forgotten. We create meaning, knowing that meaning is fragile and temporary, and yet we continue to build, to strive, to create, because this is what it means to be human, because the alternative is despair, because even temporary achievements have value, because the effort itself is meaningful regardless of outcome. The Odrysian kings understood this, perhaps. They built their kingdom knowing that kingdoms fall. They accumulated their gold knowing that gold cannot purchase immortality. They performed their rituals knowing that even the gods are subject to time. And yet they persisted, creating something remarkable, something that would echo through the centuries, something that we can still appreciate and learn from more than 2,000 years later. In the end, this is the legacy of the Odrysian Kingdom, not just the gold and the tombs, not just the political achievements and military conquests, but the example of human beings striving to create something meaningful in a world that offers no guarantees. They succeeded for a time, they failed eventually. But in their success and their failure alike, they left us something valuable, a story worth telling, a civilization worth remembering, a lesson worth learning. The Odrysian Kingdom is gone, but as long as we remember it, as long as we study it, as long as we learn from it, something of what it was continues to exist. Memory is the final victory over time, the only immortality available to mortal beings. And in this sense, at least, the Odrysians have achieved what all their gold could not purchase, a kind of eternity. The story ends here. But stories, unlike kingdoms, can be told again and again, each telling keeping alive what would otherwise be lost. Tell this story. Remember the Odrysians. And in remembering them, give them the only gift that truly matters, the gift of continued existence in human memory and human understanding. The kingdom has fallen, the legacy endures, and that perhaps is enough. But is it truly enough? This question haunted the last Thracians who remembered what their ancestors had been, who carried in their blood the memory of kings and warriors, of golden treasures and sacred rituals. For them, the fall of the Odrysian Kingdom was not merely a political event. It was a spiritual catastrophe, a rupture in the fabric of meaning that had given their lives purpose and direction. Consider the generation that witnessed the annexation of 46 CE. These were people whose grandparents had known the last independent kings, whose parents had grown up in a world where Thracian identity still meant something politically. They had watched as Roman administrators replaced Thracian nobles, as Roman law superseded Thracian custom, as Roman gods crowded into temples once dedicated to Sabazios and the Thracian rider. They had seen their world transformed, their identity erased, their heritage reduced to folklore and memory. What did they feel? The sources do not tell us directly, but we can imagine. There must have been grief, the deep, aching grief of loss that cannot be reversed. There must have been anger, the bitter, impotent anger of the conquered against their conquerors. There must have been shame, the corrosive shame of a proud people reduced to subjects, of warriors become servants, of kings become memories. But there must also have been adaptation, accommodation, the human capacity to find meaning even in diminished circumstances. Life continued after all. Children were born, crops were planted, festivals were celebrated. The rhythms of existence persisted even as the political framework that had once given them context disappeared. People found ways to preserve what mattered most: family bonds, religious beliefs, cultural practices, even as they accepted the new realities of Roman rule. The priests of the old religion faced particular challenges. Their authority had been bound up with the Odrysian state, their rituals sanctifying royal power, their prophecies guiding royal decisions. With the kingdom gone, what was their role? Some adapted, finding places within the Roman religious system, reinterpreting their traditions in ways that made them compatible with imperial expectations. Others retreated into obscurity, maintaining the old ways in secret, passing down knowledge to initiates who would carry it forward into an uncertain future. The mystery cults proved particularly resilient. Unlike the public religion of the state, which depended on political structures for its maintenance, the mysteries operated through networks of initiates bound by shared experience and sacred oaths. These networks could survive, indeed could thrive, even under foreign rule. The Roman authorities, generally tolerant of local religions as long as they did not threaten public order, allowed the mysteries to continue. And so Thracian spiritual traditions flowed into the broader stream of Mediterranean religion, influencing and being influenced by the diverse currents of that cosmopolitan world. The warrior aristocracy faced a different kind of adaptation. For generations, their identity had been defined by martial prowess, by service to the king, by the glory won in battle against the kingdom's enemies. Now there was no king to serve, no kingdom to defend. What were they to do with their skills, their traditions, their sense of who they were? Many found answers in Roman military service. The legions and auxiliary units of the empire offered opportunities for men trained in the arts of war. Thracian cavalry units, as we have noted, were highly valued by Roman commanders. Service in these units allowed Thracian warriors to maintain their martial identity, to win glory and wealth, to pass down their traditions to new generations, all within the framework of Roman imperial power. But this was a double-edged accommodation. Fighting for Rome meant fighting against Rome's enemies, who might include other peoples struggling for their own independence. It meant accepting Roman discipline, Roman command structures, Roman definitions of honor and glory. It meant becoming, in some sense, Roman, even while maintaining Thracian identity in other respects. The Thracian auxiliaries were both preservers and betrayers of their heritage, keeping alive warrior traditions while placing those traditions in service of the power that had destroyed their kingdom. The common people, farmers, craftsmen, laborers, experienced the transition differently. For them, the change of rulers may have mattered less than it did for the elite. Taxes still had to be paid, whether to Thracian kings or Roman governors. Labor still had to be performed, whether for Thracian nobles or Roman landlords. The rhythms of agricultural life, planting and harvest, birth and death, the turning of the seasons, continued regardless of who claimed political authority. Yet even for the common people, something was lost. The festivals that had celebrated Thracian kings, the rituals that had invoked Thracian gods for Thracian purposes, the sense of belonging to a distinct people with a distinct destiny. These were diminished, transformed, gradually forgotten. Over generations, the descendants of Odrysian subjects became simply provincials of the Roman Empire, their Thracian identity one element among many in their complex hybrid sense of self. The landscape itself bore witness to these transformations. Roman roads cut through Thracian territory, connecting the province to the wider empire, facilitating trade and troop movements and administrative control. Roman cities rose alongside or atop Thracian settlements, their grid-patterned streets and standardized architecture imposing Roman order on Thracian space. Roman villas dotted the countryside, their owners, whether Roman settlers or Romanized Thracians, exploiting the land according to Roman agricultural practices. Yet the land remembered. The mountains where Thracian gods had been worshipped retained their sacred character, even as the names of the gods changed. The rivers that had carried Thracian gold continued to flow, indifferent to the political arrangements of the humans who lived along their banks. The forests where Thracian hunters had pursued their prey still sheltered wild creatures, still whispered with winds that had blown since before humans walked the earth. In this persistence of the land, perhaps, lay a kind of consolation. Kingdoms rise and fall, but the earth endures. Peoples come and go, but the mountains remain. The Thracians, who had lived in intimate connection with their landscape, who had seen divinity in every spring and grove and peak, might have found comfort in this continuity. Their kingdom was gone, but the land that had shaped them, that they had shaped in turn, continued to exist. And as long as the land existed, something of what they had been existed as well. The centuries that followed the annexation saw the gradual fading of distinct Thracian identity, intermarriage with settlers from other parts of the empire, adoption of Latin, and later Greek as primary languages, conversion to Christianity, and abandonment of traditional religion. All these processes worked to dissolve the boundaries that had once separated Thracians from their neighbors. By the time the Roman Empire itself began to crumble, Thracian had become more a geographical than an ethnic designation. The great migrations of late antiquity completed this transformation. Goths, Huns, Avars, Slavs, Bulgars, wave after wave of newcomers swept through the region, each leaving their mark on its population and culture. The descendants of the ancient Thracians were absorbed into these new populations, their genetic heritage dispersed, their cultural traditions merged with those of the newcomers. Yet traces remained. Scholars have identified elements of Thracian religion in the folk practices of later Balkan peoples. The kukeri rituals of Bulgaria, with their elaborate costumes and their associations with fertility and renewal, bear striking resemblances to ancient Thracian ceremonies. The veneration of certain mountains and springs, the beliefs about supernatural beings inhabiting the natural world, the customs surrounding death and the afterlife, all these carry echoes of the ancient Thracian worldview. The Thracian rider, that enigmatic figure who appears on countless ancient monuments, found new life in Christian iconography. Saints on horseback, slaying dragons or trampling enemies, continued the visual tradition of the mounted divine protector. Saint George, in particular, absorbed many of the characteristics once attributed to the Thracian rider, becoming a focus of popular devotion throughout the Balkans and beyond. In this transformation, Thracian religious imagery achieved a kind of immortality, persisting in changed form long after its original context had been forgotten. The rediscovery of Thracian civilization in modern times has added new dimensions to this legacy. Archaeological excavations, beginning in the 19th century and continuing to the present, have unearthed treasures that reveal the sophistication and beauty of Odrysian culture. The golden artifacts of Panagyrishte and Rogosin, the painted tombs of Kazanlak and Sveshtari, the urban remains of Sitalces. These discoveries have challenged earlier assumptions about Thracian barbarism, and established the Odrysians as creators of a major ancient civilization. Modern Bulgaria has embraced this heritage with enthusiasm. The Thracians are celebrated as ancestors, their achievements claimed as part of Bulgarian national identity. Museums display Thracian artifacts with pride, schools teach Thracian history, and the ancient past is invoked in contemporary discussions of Bulgarian identity and destiny. This embrace is not without complications. The relationship between ancient Thracians and modern Bulgarians is historically complex, but it demonstrates the continuing power of the Odrysian legacy to shape present-day consciousness. The story of the Odrysian Kingdom, then, does not end with the annexation of 46 CE. It continues in the religious traditions that carried Thracian spirituality into new contexts, in the folk practices that preserved Thracian customs in transformed forms, in the archaeological discoveries that have brought Thracian civilization back into historical awareness, in the contemporary identities that claim Thracian heritage as their own. The kingdom fell, but its echoes continue to reverberate. What, finally, are we to make of this long and complex history? The Odrysian Kingdom was, in many ways, a typical ancient state, rising through military conquest maintained through a combination of force and legitimacy, eventually succumbing to more powerful rivals. Its trajectory from tribal confederation to centralized kingdom to client state to annexed province follows patterns repeated throughout ancient history. In this sense, there is nothing exceptional about the Odrysian story. And yet there is something exceptional, something that distinguishes the Odrysians from the many other ancient peoples who rose and fell without leaving significant traces. The Thracians created a distinctive civilization, one that made lasting contributions to Mediterranean culture. Their religious traditions influenced the development of mystery cults that would shape Western spirituality for millennia. Their artistic achievements, particularly in metalwork, represent some of the finest accomplishments of ancient craftsmanship. Their military traditions contributed to the armies that conquered and defended empires. More than this, the Thracians demonstrated the human capacity to create meaning in a world that offers no guarantees. They built a kingdom knowing that kingdoms fall. They accumulated treasures knowing that treasures can be lost. They worshipped gods knowing that gods can be forgotten. And yet they persisted, creating something remarkable, something that would outlast their political structures, something that we can still appreciate and learn from more than 2,000 years later. This is the deepest lesson of the Odrysian Kingdom, that human achievement is valuable even when, perhaps especially when, it is temporary. The kings who built the kingdom, the warriors who defended it, the priests who sanctified it, the craftsmen who adorned it, all knew at some level that what they were creating would not last forever. Nothing lasts forever, but they created anyway, because creation is what humans do, because the alternative is despair, because even temporary achievements have meaning. The gold that Thracian craftsmen shaped into objects of stunning beauty will eventually corrode and crumble. The tombs that Thracian kings built to house their remains will eventually collapse into dust. The memories that we preserve of Thracian civilization will eventually fade as new concerns and new interests claim human attention. Nothing is permanent. Everything passes. And yet, something persists. Not the physical objects, which are subject to entropy and decay. Not the political structures, which are subject to conquest and transformation. Not even the memories, which are subject to forgetting and distortion. What persists is something more subtle, more elusive, more profound. The human spirit that created these things. The aspiration toward meaning and beauty and transcendence that motivated Thracian civilization and motivates human civilization still. This spirit cannot be destroyed because it is not a thing that can be destroyed. It is a capacity, a potential, a way of being in the world. It manifested in the Odrysian Kingdom, and when that kingdom fell, it manifested elsewhere, in other forms, through other peoples. It manifests still, In every human effort to create something meaningful, to leave something behind, to transcend the limitations of individual mortality through collective achievement. The Odrysian Kingdom, viewed in this light, is not merely a historical curiosity, a chapter in the long story of human civilization. It is a testament to what humans can achieve, a reminder of what humans have achieved, an inspiration for what humans might yet achieve. Its fall is not a tragedy, but a transition, not an ending, but a transformation. The kingdom died, but the spirit that created it lives on. And so we return to where we began. The kingdom has fallen, the legacy endures. But now we understand more fully what this means. The legacy is not just the gold in museum cases, not just the ruins of ancient cities, not just the traces of religious traditions in later practices. The legacy is the example itself, the example of human beings striving to create something meaningful, succeeding for a time, failing eventually, but leaving behind something that matters. This is what the Odrysians gave us. This is what we inherit from them. This is what we pass on to those who come after us. The kingdom has fallen, the legacy endures, and that is more than enough. It is everything. The wind still blows across the Thracian plains, carrying with it the dust of centuries. The mountains still rise against the sky, their peaks touching the clouds where ancient Thracians believed the gods dwelt. The rivers still flow toward the sea, their waters glinting with traces of the gold that once made this land famous throughout the ancient world. And somewhere, in the soil of this ancient land, the bones of Odrysian kings still rest in their tombs, surrounded by the treasures they hoped would accompany them to eternity. They sleep now, these kings, their dreams of glory long since faded, their names preserved only in fragmentary inscriptions and scholarly reconstructions. But they sleep in the land they loved, the land they ruled, the land that shaped them and that they shaped in turn. If they could wake, what would they think of the world that has grown up around their graves? Would they recognize the descendants of their subjects, transformed by millennia of change? Would they understand the languages now spoken in their former domains? Would they comprehend the technologies, the ideologies, the ways of life that have replaced their own? Perhaps not. The world has changed too much, the distance too great. But perhaps they would recognize something, the human constants that persist beneath the surface of change. The love of family, the loyalty to community, the reverence for the sacred, the courage in the face of death. These things that mattered to the Odrysians matter still. In this recognition, across the vast gulf of time, a connection might be made. We are not so different from them, these ancient Thracians. We face the same fundamental challenges: how to live, how to die, how to find meaning in a world that offers no easy answers. We make the same fundamental choices: to create or destroy, to build or tear down, to remember or forget. We share the same fundamental fate: to live for a time, to strive for a time, and then to pass away, leaving behind whatever legacy we have managed to create. The Odrysians faced these challenges, made these choices, met this fate. They did so with courage, with creativity, with a fierce determination to make their mark on the world. They succeeded in their way. Their kingdom rose and fell, but something of what they were persists. In the gold that gleams in museum cases, in the traditions that echo through later cultures, in the very landscape of the land they once called home. This is their gift to us, not just the artifacts and the histories, but the example. The example of humans striving against the odds, creating beauty in the face of mortality, finding meaning in a world that guarantees nothing. This example speaks across the centuries, offering not answers but inspiration, not solutions but solidarity. We are all Odrysians in a sense. We all build kingdoms that will fall. We all accumulate treasures that will be lost. We all worship gods who may be forgotten. And yet we persist, because this is what humans do, because the alternative is unthinkable, because even in the face of certain eventual failure, the effort itself has value. The Odrysian Kingdom is gone. But as long as we remember it, as long as we learn from it, as long as we draw inspiration from it, something of what it was continues to exist. Memory is the final victory over time, the only immortality available to mortal beings. And in this sense at least, the Odrysians have achieved what all their gold could not purchase, a kind of eternity, preserved in human consciousness, passed down through generations, enduring as long as humans endure. The story is told, the kingdom is remembered, the legacy lives on, and somewhere, in the eternal silence of their tombs, the Odrysian kings sleep on, their work complete, their rest well earned, their place in history secure. They have done what they could, they have left what they could. They have become what all humans eventually become, memories, legacies, echoes fading slowly into the vast silence of time. But echoes, however faint, are still sounds. Memories, however distant, are still present. Legacies, however transformed, still carry forward something of their origins. The Odrysians live on in their way, and that is the final truth, the ultimate consolation, the last word in this long story of rise and fall, of glory and decline, of a kingdom that was and is no more. The kingdom has fallen. The legacy endures. The story continues forever.